She was 18 and homeless. No car, no diploma frame, no place to sleep, just an unfinished skein of cream wool in a paper sack and $7 she had earned mending a neighbour's torn winter gloves. And with that $7, she bought a deserted knitting mill in Northampton, Hampshire County, Massachusetts, a forgotten place that had fallen off town maps after 1963. The east wall leaned where frost had opened the brick. Rain came through the roof in 3 patient lines. The county had condemned it since 1989 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the bobbin room behind the highest wooden rack, in a hidden compartment that had not been opened in over 40 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Della Mae Whitcomb had been learning how to be left behind her whole life without knowing it. It began in rooms where adults lowered their voices before closing doors. It began with the sound of her mother folding bills into the kitchen drawer and smoothing them twice with her palm, as if paper could be made larger by being treated gently. It began with winter coats bought a size too big, with shoes that pinched by March, with supper held together by potatoes and onions, and the careful silence of a woman who knew exactly how far a dollar would go. Della grew up on the edge of a mill town that had already begun forgetting its own hands. The houses were narrow and tired, their porches sloping toward cracked sidewalks, their cellars smelling of damp stone and canned tomatoes. In the mornings, the Connecticut River held a low grey mist, and by afternoon the church bells sounded as if they were coming through cloth. Everything in that part of Massachusetts seemed to carry 2 lives at once, the life it had now and the life it had once been proud to have. Her mother, Luann, worked wherever she could stand upright long enough to be useful. She cleaned offices after closing packed sandwiches at a grocery counter, kept books for a man who sold used tires from a garage behind his house. She had a quiet face, not weak, not hard, only worn down into a kind of permanent listening. When Della was small, Luann would come home smelling of lemon cleaner and cold air, take off her canvas shoes by the door, and sit for 1 minute before beginning again. Della's father was never a steady shape in the house. He had been a machinist before he became a memory, a man who left behind 2 photographs, a dented lunch pail, and a box of sockets arranged by size. Luann did not speak badly of him. She did not speak much of him at all. Some losses were kept like dishes on a high shelf, present but seldom touched. When Della was 9, Luann married a man named Everett Pike, who had a square jaw, dry hands, and a way of standing in doorways as if he owned the air on both sides of them. He worked at a building supply yard south of Holyoke and kept his pay stubs in a cigar box under the bed. He believed in locks, receipts, padlocks, shut doors, exact measures, and the kind of order that made a child feel like a misplaced object. He was not loud often, that made his loudness worse when it came. Most days he ruled the house by making other people wait for his judgment. He read the electric bill at the kitchen table while the food cooled. He counted slices of bread. He checked the thermostat with 2 fingers and turned it down 1 degree at a time. If Della's schoolbooks were left on a chair, he moved them to the floor. If her coat touched his, he shook it loose. Luann adjusted herself around him slowly, the way a plant grows away from a draft. She stopped humming at the stove. She stopped inviting neighbours inside. She stopped buying the cinnamon tea she liked and began drinking whatever was cheapest in the lowest bin. Della watched these small disappearances without knowing what name to give them. Children notice the weather in a house before they understand its cause. The one person who did not change around Everett was Della's grandmother, Ruthie Bell Whitcomb. Ruthie lived in a second-floor apartment over a closed barber shop in East Hampton, where the windows faced west and caught the long, low light. She was not tall, but she had the steadiness of a fence post set deep. Her hair had gone white early, and she wore it in a braid pinned at the back of her head with 2 black combs. Her hands were broad across the knuckles, with fingers bent slightly from years of work, and when she touched wool, the wool seemed to recognize her. On Saturdays, Della took the bus to Ruthie's, carrying a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and whatever homework could wait. The apartment smelled of boiled coffee, lavender soap, beeswax, and wool kept in cedar drawers. Along the south wall stood Ruthie's hand-frame knitting machine, a flat bed frame with 120 needles, darkened by age and polished by use where the palms had travelled. It was not a toy, Ruthie said. It was not decoration. It was a tool, and tools deserve truth. The machine had come from a knitting mill that once stood near the old rail spur in Northampton, though Ruthie never said much about the owner. She had worked there as a girl, first sweeping floors, then winding bobbins, then learning to set needles under the eye of women who could hear a dropped stitch before they saw it. By the time Della knew her, Ruthie had not worked in a mill for decades, but her body still carried the tempo of it. She rose early. She tied knots cleanly. She disliked waste with a practical, unsentimental dislike. Those Saturdays became Della's real schooling. Ruthie taught her how to seat each needle so the latch opened clean and true. She taught her to oil the bed lightly, never with a flood, and to wipe away the excess with a piece of linen. She taught her how to test yarn between finger and thumb, not by softness alone, but by memory, twist, spring, and willingness. She showed her how a tension gauge could be set too proud or too slack, and how a careless setting would make an honest yarn lie. At first, Della only watched. Then she carried bobbins. Then she counted. Then she was allowed to thread the carriage under Ruthie's eye, her mouth dry with effort. When she was 8, Ruthie let her knit her first narrow strip of ribbing. It curled at the edge and widened badly in the middle, but Ruthie held it up to the afternoon light as if it were worth examination. Hands learn what the heart cannot hurry, Ruthie said. Della did not understand it then. She only knew that her grandmother did not snatch mistakes away. Ruthie let her make them all the way to their end. If a row went wrong, they did not scold the row. They lifted the work, found the error, and followed it back to the place where care had wandered. That was the meaning Ruthie gave the sentence over time. Not everything could be saved quickly. Not everything good announced itself at once. Some forms of love had to pass through the hands before the rest of the person could trust them. By 12, Della could load the flat bed with a full set of needles, all 120, checking every latch with the side of her finger. By 14, she could adjust tension for worsted wool, cotton blend, and the stubborn grey yarn Ruthie called mule-hearted. By 16, she could work her 2x2 rib by hand, transferring stitches after each row with a careful hook while Ruthie sat behind her with coffee cooling in a blue cup. There were afternoons when they did not speak for an hour. The machine gave its dry, exact clatter outside. Tires hissed on wet pavement. In the rooms below, the abandoned barber poles in the window gathered dust. Della would look at Ruthie's hands and feel something settling in her that no one at school had given her. A line, perhaps, a road, a way to belong to people she had never met because they had made things properly and left the proof behind. Ruthie kept notebooks, though Della was not allowed to open all of them. Some were ordinary, household accounts, recipes, names of women who had ordered mittens, children's chest measurements, yarn lots, repairs promised and repairs paid for in eggs. Others were wrapped in cotton cloth and tied with string. They contained patterns Ruthie copied from memory, the old mill designs, some marked with dates going back before Della was born. Leaves, ladders, honeycomb, river stones, a cable called Widow's Road, a border called December Window. "You read these like music," Ruthie told her once, tapping a page where numbers and slanted marks made no beauty until the hand obeyed them. Not with your eyes alone. When Ruthie died, it happened in November, during the first real cold of the year. She had been carrying groceries up the stairs and set them down halfway, neat as always, the brown bag folded at the top. A neighbour found her sitting on the landing, one hand still resting on the banister. There was no hospital farewell, no final lesson, no last cup of boiled coffee by the window. Only the call, the drive, the apartment with its rooms suddenly too still, and Luann pressing a handkerchief to her mouth without making a sound. The landlord wanted the apartment cleared by the end of the month. Everett arrived with boxes from the supply yard, and a mood of injured efficiency. He stood in Ruthie's kitchen reading labels aloud, deciding what had value and what did not. Della packed the blue cup, the cedar sachets, the linen oil rags, and the little brass latch hook. She asked for the hand frame. Everett looked at the machine as if it were a dead appliance. "No room," he said. "It folds partly down," Della answered. "No room." The notebooks were worse. Some went missing before Della knew enough to guard them. Everett said old paper drew mice. Luann said there had been so much to sort. A second-hand dealer came with a van and took the frame, the wooden Swift, 3 boxes of cones, and the tall cabinet where Ruthie had kept her tied bundles of patterns. Della stood beside the curb with her arms around a paper sack containing one unfinished skein of cream wool, Ruthie's black combs, and the bent brass hook she had managed to slip into her coat pocket. The last thing removed from the apartment was the chair by the west window. Its legs scraped the floorboards once, then again, and then Ruthie's room had no place left for a body to sit. After that, Della continued through high school with the careful invisibility of a girl who has learned not to ask twice. She worked in the cafeteria during lunch period and at a laundromat on weekends, folding towels while TV voices rose and fell above the dryers. She filled out college forms at the guidance office, one line at a time, using a pen with the school name on it. She wanted to study textile conservation, though she only said the words aloud once, to a counselor who nodded kindly and handed her another packet. The packet required signatures. Everett let it sit on the kitchen table for 8 days. He would move it when he wiped crumbs away. He would place his coffee mug on it without quite covering the blank line. When Della asked about it, he said he was looking it over. When Luann asked, softly, he said there was no need to invite debt into a house already carrying enough. Graduation came under a damp grey sky. Della wore a white dress from the church basement closet and shoes that rubbed her heels raw before the ceremony began. Luann cried into a tissue when Della crossed the stage. Everett clapped twice, not loudly, and checked his watch while the principal spoke about futures. At home there was no cake. There was a folded paper grocery sack on Della's bed, filled with her underclothes, 2 shirts, a sweater, her toothbrush, the unfinished wool, and Ruthie's bent brass hook wrapped in a sock. Beside the sack sat the unsigned student loan form. Everett was in the hallway, blocking the narrow passage to the stairs. Luann stood behind him with one hand on the bathroom doorframe. Her mouth had the pale, pressed look it got when she had already surrendered before words began. Everett held Della's house key between thumb and forefinger. 18 now, time you carried your own weight. 8 words, plain as boards. The key made a small sound when he dropped it into his shirt pocket. Della looked at her mother then, not at him. Luann's eyes moved to the grocery sack, then to the floor. She did not step forward. She did not say wait. She did not put her body between her daughter and the door. That silence did more than the sentence. Della lifted the paper sack. The bottom sagged under the weight of ordinary things. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of fried onions and dish soap. On the porch, the wet boards cooled through the soles of her shoes. Behind her, the door closed with care, not slammed, and that carefulness stayed with her longer than anger would have. She had $7.38 when she left. By the next morning, after a bus fare to Holyoke and a cup of coffee she made last 6 hours in a plastic booth, she had $5.11. She slept that first night in the ladies' room of a 24-hour laundromat, sitting upright on the closed toilet seat with her sack against her knees, waking whenever the door opened. In Springfield, she found 2 days of work washing dishes behind a diner near Main Street. The cook paid her in cash and gave her a cracked mug of soup at closing. She slept under the awning of a shuttered tailor shop, listening to rain click against the metal sign above her head. A police officer woke her before sunrise and told her to move along without being cruel about it. She thanked him because she had no better defense. In Chicopee, she spent one night behind a church parish hall, under a wooden picnic table with her sweater folded beneath her cheek. The grass smelled of iron and wet leaves. At dawn, an elderly woman carrying altar flowers saw her and came back 10 minutes later with a banana, 2 boiled eggs, and a paper napkin folded around $3. She did not ask for Della's story. She only said, "Eat before the sun gets high." Della kept the napkin after the food was gone. In Amherst, she read bulletin boards. She learned which cafes would let a girl sit if she bought tea, which restrooms needed a code, which campus buildings stayed unlocked until 10. Students passed her in groups wearing backpacks and speaking with the loose confidence of people whose beds existed without question. Once, she stood outside a lecture hall and listened to a professor speak about colonial trade routes, her grocery sack at her feet. the unfinished wool tucked deep inside like a small warm animal. Her money changed shape slowly. Coins became smaller meals. Dollar bills became bus rides chosen carefully. She mended a torn cuff for a woman at the bus station who paid her with quarters from a change purse. She swept hair at a barber shop for half an afternoon and was given $5 and a stale blueberry muffin. She learned not to spend before noon. She learned that hunger sharpened sound, that footsteps in an alley could be measured by intention, that a dry bench was nearly a blessing. For 6 weeks she lived between public places and the mercy of strangers who never learned her last name. She slept once in a hay barn outside Hadley after following a road past fields silvered with moonlight. The hay scratched her wrists, but it held warmth. She slept twice in the back row of a bus station until the clerk on duty changed and told her the bench was for ticketed passengers only. She spent one night in a church basement when the temperature fell hard enough for the town to open its doors to anyone who could sign a sheet and accept a bowl of canned stew. She did not call home, not once. There was a payphone outside a gas station in South Hadley, its receiver black and greasy from many hands. Della stood before it with a quarter in her palm and the number alive in her memory. Cars moved along the road, throwing light over her shoes. She could picture the kitchen table, the thermostat, Luann's bent head, Everett's cigar box. Then she put the quarter back in her pocket and walked away. Some doors do not become doors again because a person knocks. By the middle of October, she had returned to Northampton because the library there was warm, and because the librarians had the practiced kindness of people who understood that not every reader came in for books alone. The Forbes Library stood with its brick and stone dignity above the street, holding its rooms in a patient hush. Della washed her hands in the restroom, dried them under a weak machine, and sat at a long table beneath a green-shaded lamp. She went there first for heat, then for newspapers, then for the classified ads. The notice was printed in a county surplus column so narrow she nearly missed it. Hampshire County Property Disposal, structure formerly registered as Whitcomb Valley Knitting Works Annex, Ward 5, Northampton. Parcel includes condemned mill building, no utilities, no warranty, purchaser responsible for all taxes, liens, hazardous cleanup, and demolition compliance. Minimum bid, $7, public countersale, as is. The name struck her first. Whitcomb. There were enough Whitcombs in western Massachusetts for the name to mean nothing. There were Whitcombs in cemeteries, Whitcombs on school plaques, Whitcombs in the yellowed pages of town histories. Still, Della sat very still with the newspaper under her hands. The lamp hummed faintly. Across the room someone turned a page with great care. She read the notice again. Formally registered. Knitting Works, Annex. No utilities, no warranty, minimum bid $7. The amount was not rounded into dignity. It was not 50, not 100, not even 10. $7 sounded like a thing priced to disappear, a number chosen because paperwork required a number. It sounded like a county clerk had looked at a dead building and given it the smallest legal weight he could give. Della copied the address onto the back of an old envelope. Her pencil point broke once. She sharpened it with the little blade at the reference desk and copied the parcel number too, though she did not understand how parcel numbers worked. Then she carried the newspaper to the librarian and asked, as carefully as she could, where the county clerk's office was. The librarian had silver-rimmed glasses and a cardigan the colour of oatmeal. She looked at Della's paper sack, then at the notice, then back at Della's face without asking the wrong question. "Main Street," she said. "Past the courthouse, they open at 8:30. Do they take cash?" "I believe they do." Della thanked her and returned to the table. She did not move for a long time. All around her, Northampton continued with its ordinary afternoon. A delivery truck backed into an alley. A child whispered too loudly near the picture books. Radiators knocked in the walls. Someone outside laughed, and the sound rose briefly, then vanished under traffic. Della placed her hand inside the grocery sack and touched the unfinished wool Ruthie had left behind. The cream strand still looped around the needle where the work had stopped. A building could be ruined and still be standing. A machine could be silent and still remember motion. A name could survive on a county notice after everyone who loved it had gone. That evening, she counted her money in the library restroom with the door locked. 7 $1 bills, 3 dimes, a nickel, and 3 pennies. She separated the bills from the coins and smoothed them flat against the porcelain sink. They looked thin, insufficient, almost shy. Then she folded them once and placed them inside the envelope with the parcel number. The coins went back into her pocket. She spent that night in the covered entry of a closed insurance office, sitting with her knees drawn up and her sack beneath her coat. The October air smelled of leaves, exhaust, and rain that had not yet fallen. She did not sleep much. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw Ruthie's hand moving across the needle bed, setting one latch right before the carriage passed. At dawn, she walked to Main Street before the courthouse clock had struck 8. The sidewalks were washed pale with early light. Shopkeepers turned keys in locks. A man hosed down the front of a bakery, pushing last night's leaves into the gutter. Della stood across from the county building until her fingers went stiff around the envelope. Her hair was brushed as well as she could manage. Her face was clean. The paper sack rested at her feet. At 8:30, the clerk unlocked the door. Della waited until 2 people in coats went in ahead of her. Then she lifted the sack, crossed the street, and stepped into the county office, with the $7 held flat between her fingers, like a deed already written in another life. The bus left Northampton with a sigh from its brakes and a thin smell of diesel rising through the floor. Della sat 3 rows behind the driver, her paper sack between her shoes, the folded county receipt inside her coat where the envelope had been. The clerk had told her the property sat beyond the older part of Ward 5, near the remnant of a rail spur that no longer carried anything but weeds and rainwater. It was not far by car. By foot, she was told, it would be a mean distance, especially with weather coming down from the north. She had thanked him anyway. The bus took her as far as the last stop before the road bent away toward East Hampton. From there she walked. The day had narrowed into late October, with the trees mostly bare and the sky a dull pewter colour over the hills. She counted distance by telephone poles at first, then by the ache rising through her ankles. Traffic thinned until the sound of each passing car seemed to travel ahead of itself, a low rush before the vehicle appeared. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had fallen to 42 degrees. She knew because the driver at a gas station, a woman with short red hair and a wool vest, had checked the thermometer beside the register while Della bought nothing and stood near the door long enough to warm her fingers. Dropping after dark, the woman said to no one in particular. Della kept walking. She passed farm fields cut down to stubble, a cemetery with slate stones leaning like tired shoulders, and a shuttered produce stand where a hand-painted sign still promised sweet corn. Her shoes were not made for distance. They rubbed against the backs of her heels and gathered road dust along the seams once. When a gust came across an open field, she stopped and turned her back to it, holding the paper sack against her chest until the wind passed through the dry grass and lost interest in her. By the time evening began to collect under the trees, she had not reached the property. There was a hay barn set back from the road, its sliding door open 6 inches where the track had rusted and refused to close. True, Della stood beside the ditch for a while, listening. No voices, no engine, no dog, only the dry shift of stalks in the field and the loose tap of a metal hinge. She crossed carefully, climbed through the gap, and waited inside until her eyes adjusted. The barn held the stored warmth of cut hay, faint and sweet under the colder smell of dust, oil and mouse droppings. She climbed onto the lowest stack, found a hollow where 2 bales had settled apart, and sat with her knees under her chin. The paper sack stayed under her coat. Her breath made a pale blur. At some point near midnight, she woke with her teeth set hard together and saw moonlight lying across the barn floor like a folded sheet. The temperature fell to 34 degrees before dawn. She rose before the owner could find her. Hay clung to her skirt and the sleeves of her sweater. Her fingers were stiff enough that she fumbled twice with the sack, and the unfinished wool slipped loose for a moment, its cream strand catching on a splint. She freed it slowly, not wanting to break the yarn. Then she crossed back to the road and walked in the blue hour before morning, when the world appears clean only because it has not yet been examined. Northampton received her after sunrise with chimneys smoking and windows beginning to brighten. It was not the downtown people put on postcards, not from the direction she entered. The first business she passed was a tire repair shop with 3 snow tires stacked by the door. Then came a narrow laundromat named Pearl Street Wash, where the windows were fogged and 2 women stood inside folding sheets. Across from it sat a diner with a tin sign for coffee and pie, its stalls already half full. A feed and grain store occupied the corner, with burlap sacks arranged beneath a striped awning. Farther along was a hardware store, its front window crowded with rakes, stovepipe sections, lamp wicks, rope, putty knives, and a hand-lettered sign that read "Cold weather coming, do not wait." Della noticed the sign, then kept walking. The county clerk's office stood inside a brick municipal building that had been added to and corrected over the years, until no part of it seemed fully at ease with another. There were stone steps worn shallow in the middle and brass handles darkened where many hands had touched them. Inside, the air smelled of floor wax, paper, damp wool coats, and the faint mineral heat of radiators. Della paused just inside the door. The lobby held 3 wooden benches, a bulletin board with notices pinned in straight lines, and a glass case containing old-town photographs. Men and women moved through the space with purposeful faces, carrying folders, keys, stamped envelopes, and the authority of belonging to errands that made sense. Della wiped her shoes on the mat until there was nothing more to wipe away. A sign pointed to property records and public sales. The counter in that office was high enough that Della had to stand straight to see over it. Behind it were shelves of deed books, file boxes, rolled maps and cabinets labelled by range in fading black letters. A calendar from a local bank hung beside a clock that ticked with office patience. At a side desk, a woman in a brown cardigan typed with 2 fingers, stopping every so often to press her lips together and examine what she had done. At the main counter sat a clerk whose nameplate read MRS, Eleanor Haskell. She had close-cut grey hair, a long neck, and gold-rimmed glasses attached to a chain. Her blouse was buttoned to the throat, and her cardigan's sleeves were pushed up evenly to the forearms. There was nothing soft in the arrangement of her desk. 3 pens lay parallel beside a blotter. Stamps stood in a wooden rack. A brass bell sat at the corner, though she did not seem like a woman who enjoyed being summoned. She looked up when Della approached, then lowered her eyes to the paper sack, the worn shoes, the folded envelope held in both hands. "Yes, I came about the property disposal notice." Mrs. Haskell did not reach for the envelope yet. "Which property?" Della read the parcel number from the back where she had copied it. A faint change passed over the clerk's face, not surprise exactly, but attention sharpened by recognition of a troublesome thing. She turned in her chair, opened a drawer, removed a file with a red strip across its tab, and placed it on the counter without opening it. "You understand this is a condemned structure?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county makes no claim that it is habitable?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there are no connected utilities, no running water, no electricity, no gas service, no inspected heat?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the purchaser assumes responsibility for taxes, liens, structural danger, and any required clean-up?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Haskell opened the folder. "You understand that if the demolition order is enforced, ownership does not spare the building unless the order is appealed and the property brought into compliance?" Della's hands tightened around the envelope. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk looked over the top of her glasses. "You understand that means the county can still require it to come down?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you understand $7 is only the legal minimum purchase price? It is not the cost of keeping the place?" Della nodded, then found her voice again. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Haskell regarded her for a long moment, and the clock on the wall completed 3 steady beats. "Do you have identification?" Della did. A school identification card, a birth certificate folded inside a plastic sleeve, and a state learner's permit she had never been able to turn into a license. The clerk examined each item, wrote Della's name on a form, and asked for her current address. The question entered the room and stood there between them. "I do not have one." Mrs. Haskell's pen stopped. "For mailing purposes," she said, with careful exactness. Della swallowed. "Could I use general delivery at the post office?" The clerk tapped the pen once against the paper, then wrote something in a small, neat hand. For the time being. The deed was not grand. It was thin county paper with plain language and spaces where names and dates had to be placed. The property entered Della's life through black type, legal description, registry book numbers, boundary references, and the patient machinery of local government. Mrs. Haskell turned each sheet toward her and marked the signature lines with a pencil dot. "Sign exactly as your identification reads." Della did. Her hand shook only once, at the middle initial. She waited for the clerk to notice, but Mrs. Haskell had already drawn the page away and laid another before her. There were disclosures, acknowledgements, a purchaser responsibility form, a notice of condemnation, a tax statement, and one yellow sheet explaining appeals. Della signed where she was told, she dated where she was told, she printed her name twice more. At the end, Mrs. Haskell held out her hand for the payment. Della removed the envelope from inside her coat. The 7 $1 bills had softened from being folded and carried, and their corners had curled slightly. She placed them on the counter and smoothed each one with the side of her thumb. Mrs. Haskell counted them without expression, then opened a receipt book, wrote the amount, tore the top sheet free, and laid it beside the deed copy. The brass stamp came last. It had a heavy round base and a handle worn dark at the grip. Mrs. Haskell slid the paper beneath it, adjusted the corner with one finger, and brought the handle down. The sound was not loud, but it had weight. A seal rose in the page, a pale circle pressed into the fibres. Della looked at it and understood, without feeling triumph, that the law had made a kind of shelter before the building itself had. Mrs. Haskell gathered the documents and placed them in a manila envelope. Then she drew a map on the back of a county notice. Her pencil moved precisely. "Main Street West to Bridge Road," she said. "Follow it past the old cemetery. At the fork, take the road toward Florence, but do not go all the way in. There is a lane, locals still call Shuttle Road, though it may not be marked. You will pass a grey farmhouse with a green roof, then a row of black walnut trees. The mill sits beyond them, down toward the low ground." Della watched every line appear. "If you reach the creek bridge with the iron railings, you have gone too far." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Haskell set the pencil down. "And you will not go in after dark." Della looked at her. "That was not a question," the clerk said. "No, ma'am." The older woman placed the deed envelope in Della's hands. Her fingers rested briefly on the paper before letting go. Then, just as Della stepped back from the counter, Mrs. Haskell said, "Whitcomb." Della stopped. The clerk was looking not at the deed now, but at Della's face with an expression she had carefully withheld until the transaction was complete. "Are you kin to Ruth Bell Whitcomb?" The name spoken in that office among deed books and stamps seemed to uncover a window inside the day. "She was my grandmother." Mrs. Haskell removed her glasses and held them by the chain. Without them her eyes looked older and less official. "I thought so. There is something around the mouth." Della did not know what to say. "I knew Ruth when I was a girl," the clerk continued. "Not well. My mother took piecework from her now and again. Mittens mostly, good ones. She worked for that mill before it closed, back when people still believed a town ought to keep its own trade alive." Della's grip changed around the envelope. Mrs. Haskell opened the red-striped folder again and turned 2 pages. Not searching for a form now, but for memory. The Annex was the last piece of it left in county hands. Main building burned in the 70s. The office wing went for storage and then failed. This one was too poor even for storage. No one wanted the liability. The office around them continued. Typewriter keys struck paper. A door opened and closed. Somewhere down the hall a man coughed. "Did my grandmother work in that Annex?" Mrs. Haskell looked toward the window where the morning light had weakened behind cloud. "I cannot swear to the room, but I remember my mother saying Ruth knew every frame in the place by sound. She could tell which carriage was riding hard from the doorway." Della lowered her eyes. The clerk reached into her top drawer and removed one of the 7 bills. For a moment Della thought there had been a mistake, that the payment was short or improper, but Mrs. Haskell folded the bill lengthwise once and slipped it beneath a paperweight shaped like the old courthouse. "I will mark the receipt paid," she said. The county will not miss the sentiment. I do not understand. No, Mrs. Haskell said. I imagine you do not. She did not explain further. She returned the remaining bills to the cash drawer, signed the receipt with her initials, and placed the county seal over the line. Her face resumed its careful official form, but something had altered in the air between them, something modest and kept. At the door, Della turned back. Mrs. Haskell. Yes. Was it a good place? The clerk considered the question as if it deserved better than nostalgia. It was a working place, she said. That can be a kind of goodness, if the work was honest. Della nodded once and left the office. Outside, the day had turned colder. The town moved around her with late morning purpose. Tires whispering over damp pavement, a deliveryman carrying bread trays into the diner, two women speaking near the steps with their collars turned up. Della stood beneath the municipal building's stone arch and looked at the manila envelope in her hands. It was not heavy. It ought to have been heavier considering what it contained. She put it inside her coat and began walking. Bridge Road took her past houses set close to the sidewalk, then farther apart. The old cemetery appeared on her left, enclosed by a low stone wall and iron gate. Some of the stones were so weathered their names had become part of the surface again. Maples stood among them, nearly bare. A crow lifted from one branch and crossed the road without hurry. The fork came after a mile and a half. She chose the left road toward Florence as Mrs. Haskell had instructed. The pavement narrowed. A school bus passed her, empty now, its yellow sides dulled by mud. Children's voices seemed to remain in the air after it was gone. Farther along, a man in a knit cap raked leaves into a tarp beside a white house. He paused and watched her pass, not suspiciously, only with the long rural gaze given to anyone walking where most people drove. A dog came out at the grey farmhouse with the green roof. It was large and black, with white around the muzzle and one ear folded wrong. It barked twice from the porch, then came down the steps stiffly, tail uncertain. Della stopped and let it decide what she was. The dog circled at a distance, nose working. Then it sneezed, gave up its duty, and returned to the porch where an old man in suspenders had appeared at the door. "You lost," he called. "I'm looking for Shuttle Road." The man lifted his chin toward the trees ahead. "Past the walnuts. Lane's gone soft. Watch your step." "Thank you." He raised one hand, then went back inside. The dog watched from the porch with grave disinterest. The black walnut trees stood in a row along the old lane, taller than the houses behind her, their branches bare enough to show the sky through them. The ground beneath was littered with fallen hulls, dark green turned black, some crushed under tires long ago, others whole and giving off their bitter clean smell. Della followed the lane between them. It was not marked. Grass grew through the centre and the ruts held water in the low places. The neighbours thinned behind her. The town did not disappear. Exactly, it loosened. The sound of cars softened. The air took on creek damp, leaf mould and iron. She saw the rail spur before she saw the mill, two dull ribbons half buried under weeds, running nowhere with a kind of stubborn dignity. Then the building came into view. It stood lower than she had imagined, long rather than tall, built of red brick darkened by rain and years of shade. The front measured perhaps 80 feet across, with a central door under a shallow timber hood and two rows of narrow windows, most boarded from the inside. One corner had sunk enough that the brick line bowed toward the earth. The roof was slate in places and tar patch in others, with several sheets of corrugated metal nailed where better repair had failed. A square brick chimney rose from the rear, cracked along one side but still upright. Above the door hung the sign, Whitcomb Valley Knitting Works Annex. The paint had gone pale, moss filled the cuts of some letters, and one iron bracket had twisted so the sign leaned downward at the right. Beneath the name, in smaller lettering nearly lost, was a date, 1891. Della stood still at the end of the lane. The building had the plain face of a place made for labour, not display. No carved trim, no porch, no softening gesture except the proportions of the windows, which had been set to admit as much light as the machines required. A low-loading platform ran along the east side, its boards silvered and split. At the rear, beyond a spill of sumac and wild grapevine, the ground dropped toward a creek she could hear but not yet see. She walked once around the outside before touching the door. The east wall did lean. Frost had opened the mortar in long seams, and a few bricks near the base had loosened enough to show shadow behind them. The roof had lost slate along the south slope. Rainwater had come through for years and left black trails down the brick. One window had broken entirely, and a sapling had grown close to the wall as if trying to look inside. Near the loading platform she found an iron ring set into stone, perhaps for tying wagons when wagons still came. Beside it lay a rusted length of chain, half hidden in leaves. She did not pick it up. She was beginning to understand that the building would require permission of a kind no deed could grant. The front door was swollen in its frame. Mrs. Haskell had given her a key attached to a tag reading County Lock Temp. It entered the padlock but resisted turning until Della pressed the lock body against the hasp and tried again. The shackle released with a dry snap. She lifted it free, slid the bolt, and put both hands against the door. It opened 4 inches, then stopped. She leaned her shoulder into it. Something dragged along the floor inside, a scrape that travelled through the wood and into her bones. The gap widened enough for cold air to breathe out. It smelled of dust, wet plaster, mouse nests, machine oil gone sour, and old wool sealed in dark. Della waited with one hand over her mouth, not from disgust, but from the force of entering air that had been kept too long. The front room received her slowly. Light came in through cracks between boards over the windows, thin as thread. Dust moved in those narrow beams, rising where her shoes disturbed it. The floor was maple plank, dark with oil and age, buckled in 2 places where water had stood. Along the walls were hooks, empty shelves, a time clock without cards, and a row of rusted metal lockers. One locker door hung open, showing a cloth cap collapsed on its shelf like a sleeping bird. There was a front office behind a half wall of cloudy glass. Its door was stuck open. A desk remained inside, one drawer missing, another swollen shut. Papers lay in curled stacks on the floor, mostly blank forms eaten at the edges. A calendar from 1962 still hung above the desk, turned to November. Someone had circled a date in pencil, then never returned to explain why. Della did not touch the calendar. She moved into the main workroom. There the machines stood. Not many. Not a factory floor like the photographs in town histories, but enough to make the room feel occupied even in abandonment. 3 flat-bed knitting frames sat under canvas covers that had sagged with dust. 2 circular sock machines stood near the north wall, their needle cylinders dark and fine as crownwork. A winding bench held 6 spindles beside it. A swift had collapsed on one side but retained its delicate logic. Wooden bobbins filled shallow crates. Some still carried wool faded to dun, blue, brown, and the yellowed colour of old cream. Cobwebs bridged the upper beams. Rain had found a path near the back and left a stain shaped like a long hand down the plaster on the floor. Mice had scattered paper, lint, and husks from the walnut trees. But beneath all of it, beneath neglect and cold and damage, there remained an order that had not fully been erased. Machines faced the light. Tables stood where hands could pass from one task to the next. The room still knew why it had been made. Della set her paper sack on a bench and stood in the middle of the floor. She listened. At first there was only the wind along the roof and the occasional tick of water dropping somewhere in the rear rooms. Then the building began to separate itself into smaller sounds. A loose board shifting under its own memory, a pane fragment trembling in a window frame, the far murmur of creek water beyond the back wall, no human voice, no engine, no clock that kept true time. She should have been afraid. Instead, she was careful. She found the back room through a door beside the winding bench. It opened into a narrower space where shelves climbed nearly to the ceiling. Bobbins filled the racks in uneven rows, some empty, some wrapped with the last work of hands long absent. A ladder hung on iron hooks along the wall. The room smelled different from the front. Cedar dust, dry wood, old lanolin, and the mineral damp of brick close to earth. This, though she did not yet know its importance, was the bobbin room. The highest rack cast a deep shadow. One board near the top sat a fraction out of line with the others, but from the doorway it looked like ordinary damage, one more small failure among hundreds. Della looked up at it only briefly, noting the height, the dust, the fact that the shelves had been built by someone who expected them to last. Then she turned away. There were too many immediate needs between her and curiosity. She had to find a place to sleep. The front office seemed less exposed than the workroom. Its glass partition held back some draft, and the desk could block the door if she needed it to. She swept the floor with a broken broom she found behind the lockers, moving dust, mouse droppings and paper scraps into a corner. The broom shed more bristles than it gathered, but the act of sweeping made a boundary. This part was where she would lie down. That part was what she would face tomorrow. From her sack, she removed the sweater, the unfinished wool, the brass hook, and the napkin she had kept from the woman in Chicopee. She folded the sweater twice to make a pillow. The wool she placed beside it, not because it had use in the night, but because Ruthie's hand had been in it. The brass hook went into her shoe, tucked at the toe where she would feel if anyone moved it. By late afternoon the cold had settled into the building. She went outside once to gather dry leaves and look for water. The creek behind the mill ran shallow over stones, brown with fallen leaves but moving clear where it passed through a narrow channel. She knelt on the bank and washed her hands until they ached. She did not drink yet. She would have to learn whether there was a better source, a well or pump, something people had used when work filled the rooms. For now she filled an old glass jar she found near the loading platform and carried it inside for washing. There was no food except the heel of bread given to her that morning by a woman at the diner who had seen her standing too long near the window. Della ate half before dark and wrapped the rest in paper for morning. She did not light a fire. She had found a stove in the back of the workroom, a squat iron thing with a cracked mica window, but the chimney had not been examined, and Ruthie had taught her that old flues could kill more quietly than hunger, so she accepted the cold. Evening entered by degrees. The light thinned between the boards until the machines became hulking shapes, their covers grey, their edges softened. The front office darkened sooner than the room outside it. Della sat on the floor with her back against the desk and listened to the building change after sundown. Outside the creak grew louder because everything else grew still. Somewhere in the wall a mouse scratched for 3 minutes, stopped, then began again. Wind moved through the broken rear window and found every crack. The sign above the door creaked on its bracket, a slow metal complaint. Della pulled her knees under the sweater and breathed into her hands. She tried not to think of the kitchen she had left. Not the table, not the thermostat, not the closed bedroom door. Those belonged to another arrangement of life, one that had already refused her. Here the refusal was different. The mill did not pretend to be safe. It did not pretend warmth. It did not ask her to be grateful for cruelty. It simply stood, damaged and exact, offering nothing more than the truth of its walls. After full dark, she unwrapped the unfinished skein. The wool was not much to look at in that light. Cream gone slightly grey from handling, a little uneven where Ruthie had joined one strand to another. Della held it between her fingers and let the old motion come, not knitting, not properly, only straightening, finding the end, turning the loose work carefully so no stitch slipped free. Her hands remembered before the rest of her settled. For a while, the room was less empty. She could almost hear the dry carriage travel of Ruthie's frame, the careful click of latches, the faint breath Ruthie made through her nose when concentrating. She could see the west apartment window, the blue cup, the small brass lamp, the tied notebooks that had been taken away. Memory did not comfort her exactly. It gave her something to hold that was not hunger or fear. Near midnight, the temperature inside the office dropped low enough that sleep came in broken pieces. She woke with her shoulders clenched. She woke to a drip. She woke to the sound of her own breath. Once, she opened her eyes and saw moonlight crossing the main workroom through a crack in the boards, falling over the covered machines in a pale stripe. They looked less like abandoned equipment then, and more like animals resting under blankets, patient and not yet ready to rise. Della stood and walked through the room in her socks because the floorboards had begun teaching her where they creaked. She learned the soft spot near the time clock, the raised nail beside the winding bench, the plank in the doorway that complained under the right foot but not the left. In the bobbin room, she paused again, drawn by a smell she could not name at first. Cedar, dust, wool grease, something dry and metallic beneath it. Her eyes travelled up the shelves. The highest board remained crooked in the dark, just visible as a line against deeper shadow. She stood there until cold entered through the soles of her feet, then turned back toward the office. Whatever the room kept, it had kept it longer than one night. It could wait. Before dawn, rain began. Not a storm, only a steady cold rain that found the holes in the roof and returned the building to its old habit of endurance. One drip fell into a metal pan somewhere near the stove, another struck wood, a third made a dull sound against paper. The three notes did not match, but after a while they seemed almost measured, a poor kind of music. Della lay on the floor beneath the desk, wrapped in her sweater, with the manila envelope under her ribs so the damp could not reach it. The deed pressed against her through the paper beyond the glass partition. The machines stood in the grey before morning. Beyond them the bobbin room waited with its high shelf and its small crooked board. She did not know what the building held. She only knew that she had arrived. The mill was patient. So was she. By the third morning, Della had learned that the floor spoke differently according to the weather. In dry cold, the maple planks gave short, sharp replies underfoot, like a person correcting a mistake. In rain they softened and sighed, especially near the rear wall where water had travelled through old mortar and found the underside of the boards. She marked those places with small torn strips of paper, not because paper would save her from falling through, but because naming a danger made it less likely to surprise her. She began each day before light reached the east windows. There was a rhythm to surviving in a building not yet ready to shelter anyone. First she folded the sweater and shook dust from it. Then she checked the deed envelope and slid it back beneath the desk drawer where damp would not find it easily. Then she walked the main room barefoot in the grey, listening for any change from the night before. A new drip, a fallen brick, the thin scratch of mice behind the office wall. The mill did not speak in sentences, but it gave information to those patient enough to receive it. On the first full day, she found the well. It stood behind the building, not near the creek as she had expected, but halfway between the rear wall and a line of sumac, covered by a round slab of concrete with an iron ring set into it. She could not lift the slab entirely. It took both hands and most of her weight to drag it 2 inches aside. A cold mineral breath rose from below. She lay flat on her stomach, held a loose pebble over the opening, and let it fall. The sound came back after a long second. Water. Not enough knowledge to trust, but enough to mark the place. She replaced the slab as far as she could and spent an hour clearing leaves from around it with her hands. Near the sumac, half lost under vines, she found a hand pump bolted to a short stone platform. Its handle moved only an inch at first. Rust had taken the hinge. The leather cup inside, if it remained at all, would likely be dry and useless. Still, there it was, proof that people had once arranged the property for living hours, not merely labour. The outhouse stood beyond the walnuts. Its door had fallen inward, and the roof carried a long depression full of leaves. A half-moon had been cut in the upper plank by some earlier hand, the edges worn soft by weather. Della did not pretend the little building was pleasant. She found a shovel in the loading area, cleaned broken glass from the path, propped the door back into place with a length of split board, and promised herself she would make it decent before snow. On the second day she learnt the sound of the roof. There were 3 leaks in steady rain, as she had noticed the first night, but there were other weaknesses. One place above the rear work table where water collected before falling in a sudden cupful, one seam near the chimney that dampened the brick without dripping, and a soft moss-edged patch above the bobbin room. She moved crates and canvas covers away from the worst places. She set pans and jars beneath water. When a rusty coffee tin filled halfway, she carried it outside and emptied it with the same attention she might have given to a bowl of soup. On the third day she walked to the hardware store. It was the same store she had passed on the morning she came into town, with the crowded front window and the hand-lettered warning about cold weather. The sign over the door read Pritchard Hardware and Stove, though one corner had peeled enough that the P looked uncertain. Inside, the store smelled of seed packets, iron, paraffin, cut rope, lamp oil, dust, and the dry sweetness of cedar shavings. The aisles were narrow with wooden bins that had labels written in black marker over older labels written in pencil. Nails were sold by the pound. Stove gaskets hung beside mousetraps. A rack of work gloves stood near the counter like empty hands waiting to be chosen. The owner was a compact man with a white beard trimmed close to his jaw and a left eye clouded at the edge, not blind but pale enough to make his gaze seem partly turned inward. His suspenders were green, his shirt cuffs had been darned in 2 different browns. He was weighing screws on a brass scale when Della entered, and he did not look up until the doorbell finished trembling. "You are the girl who bought the Annex," he said. It was not a question. Della held her paper sack closer. "Yes, sir." "Name?" "Della Whitcomb." He brushed 3 screws from the scale pan into a paper packet, folded it, and wrote a price on the outside. "Calvin Pritchard." She nodded. He looked her over without the insult of pity. His eyes paused on her shoes, then on the wool cuff showing from the sack, then on the cracked skin around her knuckles. "You got heat?" "No, sir." "You got water?" "There is a well. I have not opened it properly." "You got sense enough not to use that chimney yet?" "Yes, sir." He gave one short nod as if this answer kept the conversation alive. Della took the county notice from her coat pocket and unfolded the list she had made in pencil. It was not a proper repair list. It was the list of someone who knew she needed everything and could afford almost nothing. Matches, lamp wick, oil, a bucket, soap, nails, a putty knife, wire brush, stove blacking, rope, cheesecloth, mousetraps, a cheap hammer if one could be had. She placed it on the counter. Mr. Pritchard read without touching it. "You cannot buy a building back from death with that." "No, sir." "What can you pay today?" Della opened her palm. 3 dimes, a nickel, and 3 pennies lay there, along with the quarter she had not used at the payphone. Mr. Pritchard looked at the coins, then at her face. "I can work," she said. "Sweep, carry, stack, write labels, whatever you need." He took a pencil from behind his ear and turned the list over. "I keep accounts for farmers through mud season and painters through summer. I can keep one for a Whitcomb through winter, provided you do not lie to me." "I will not, provided you come every Saturday morning and settle what you can." "Yes, sir." "Provided you do not buy foolishness before mortar, water, and heat." "Yes, sir." He wrote her name at the top of a small ledger card, then paused. "Any relation to Ruth Bell?" "My grandmother." The pencil moved again, slower this time. "She hemmed my sister's wedding gloves," he said, "knitted them first, then hemmed the wrist with silk. My sister said no store pair ever fit her right after that." Della kept still. The name continued to open doors before she reached them. Mr. Pritchard set the pencil down and went behind a curtain into the back room. She heard boxes being moved, then a drawer opening hard. He returned with a book whose cover had been reinforced with cloth tape. The title in faded red letters read "Practical Repairs for House and Shop, 1948 edition." "Manual is free," he said. "Not charity. It has been here since before I bought the place, and no one under 60 has opened it except to press leaves." Della took it with both hands. He began pulling items from shelves with no show of generosity, only the grave efficiency of a man filling an order properly. 1 used galvanized bucket, 75 cents on account, 2 lamp wicks, 8 cents each, 1 pint kerosene, 19 cents, blue kitchen matches, 6 cents, bar soap, 5 cents, wire brush, 22 cents, putty knife with a cracked handle, 12 cents, 1 pound 8 penny common nails, 9 cents, ½ pound 6 penny finish nails, 7 cents, mouse traps 3 for a dime, 50 feet of sash cord, to be charged later because the tag had fallen off and he would not guess. He added a small hammer from beneath the counter, its handle polished dark where another palm had owned it first. "That one is not new," he said. "I can see. Head is tight." "I believe you." "Do not leave it out in rain." "No, sir." He wrote the prices in the ledger not quickly, and turned the card so she could see. The total already looked larger than her courage. $2.11 on account, paid 38 cents. Balance $1.73. He underlined it once. Chimney first, he said. No fire until you clean and test. Brush from top if you can get safe access, from below if you cannot. Mirror, lamp, listen, smell. If soot comes down in sheets, you stop and come tell me. Della nodded. He added one more item, a round chimney brush with wire bristles. Loaned, deposit waived, return before Sunday supper. Do you know how? No, sir. He opened the repair manual to a chapter marked Heating Flues and Chimneys, spat lightly on his thumb to separate two stuck pages, then turned the book toward her. Read it twice before you climb anything. I will. 3 times if you are scared. She looked up. He did not smile. Scared people who read instructions live longer. The walk back was harder because the bucket handle cut into her fingers and the manual dragged against her side in the sack. Still, she felt the odd strengthening that came from carrying useful things. Not enough things, not sufficient things, but exact ones. The hammer, the wire brush, the book with diagrams of flues, dampers, clean outdoors, capstones, smoke shelves, and the places creosote like to hide. At the mill, she set everything on the office desk and arranged the supplies in a line. It comforted her to see them there, small proofs against disorder. Then she began with the chimney. The stove stood at the rear of the workroom, squat, black, and rust-freckled, with a 6-inch pipe rising from its back into the chimney wall. The pipe had 3 joints before it entered the thimble, each joint sealed badly with old furnace cement that had cracked like dried mud. She did not move the stove at first. She read the manual once sitting on the floor, then again standing beside the pipe, matching the drawing to what was before her. Then she read the chapter a 3rd time because her hands were cold and fear, as Mr. Pritchard had said, could be put to work. She spread old newspaper beneath the pipe and used the wire brush to clean around each joint. Rust fell in orange dust, a beetle shell dropped out from under the collar. When she loosened the first screw, the pipe shifted, and a smell came out that was dry, bitter, and old as burned winters. She worked each screw free with the putty knife and the edge of the hammer because she had no screwdriver large enough. 2 heads stripped, 1 snapped. She stopped after that, sat back on her heels, and studied the problem until impatience passed. By noon, she had the pipe separated. Soot lay inside in thick flakes, not powder but layered crust. Creosote, the book said, could shine like black glass where slow smoke cooled against the flue. It could burn inside a chimney with a sound like freight and split brick from within. Della placed the pipe sections outside on the loading platform and brushed them until her arms trembled. She used rags torn from the worst of the office papers, wiping, scraping, turning each section toward the weak light. The chimney clean-out was near the floor, a small iron door set into the brick behind the stove. It opened only after she tapped the hinge carefully for 10 minutes and worked the edge with the putty knife. Behind it lay packed soot and broken mortar. She scooped it into the bucket by handfuls, wearing no gloves because she had not bought any, blackening her nails until her hands looked older than her face. Twice she found bird bones. Once she found a walnut shell carried by some animal into the dark. The brush from Mr. Pritchard had a threaded end, meant for rods she did not have. She solved it with sash cord, tying the brush handle through its eye and weighting the far end with a rusted hinge found near the lockers. From the roof would have been better, the manual said so, but the roof could not yet be trusted, and the chimney rose above a slope slick with moss, so she worked from below. She fed the brush up through the clean-out inch by inch, turning it, drawing it down, pushing again. Soot came first in soft falls, then harder clumps that struck the bucket with dull sounds. Her shoulders burned, the cord twisted. The brush caught twice, and each time she froze, breathing through her nose, easing it down until the wire released. She used the lamp and a piece of broken mirror to inspect the lower flue, angling light upward. The inner brick looked rough, but not collapsed. The smoke shelf held another load of soot, which she scraped free with the bent handle of a discarded file. The work took 6 hours the first day and 3 more the second morning. By the end she had removed 2 full buckets of soot, creosote flakes, nests and grit. She carried them outside and dumped them well away from the building where rain could darken them without carrying them back through the door. Then she cleaned the stove itself, ash pan, grate interior walls, mica window, cloudy but present, hinges, draft slide. She found the maker's mark under grime, Florence Stoveworks No. 8. The first fire was no larger than 2 hands. She used dry twigs from beneath the loading platform, a curl of paper, and 1 match. The flame took, wavered, and nearly died. She crouched with her face level to the mica window, watching the smoke. It hesitated at first, gathered inside the stove as a grey thought, then lifted. The pipe warmed. The chimney drew outside. She hurried to the rear wall and looked up. A thin, straight ribbon of smoke rose from the cracked chimney and disappeared into the cold air without rolling back through the brick. She stood there until she was sure. That evening she made her first hot meal in the mill. It was only water heated in a dented tin cup, poured over oats Mr. Pritchard had added to her parcel without listing them. She stirred with the handle of the spoon she had carried from no kitchen, ate slowly, and kept the cup close to the stove so the last bites stayed warm. The heat did not fill the building. It made a circle no wider than a bedspread, but within that circle her fingers loosened, her shoulders lowered, and the machines around her seemed less like witnesses and more like companions waiting under dust. After heat came inventory. Della tore blank backs from old office forms and began numbering them. She worked from front to back, left to right, as Ruthie would have insisted. Not all this, not machines, not ruin, but object by object, condition by condition, possibility by possibility. Front office, 1 oak desk, water damage, left drawer missing, right drawer stuck, 1 chair, broken rear rung, repairable, 1 calendar, November 1962, preserve, 2 glass inkwells, empty, 1 time clock, casing intact, mechanism unknown. 8 metal lockers, 5 closed, 3 open contents, cap, apron, 2 mouse nests, 1 button card, 3 pay envelopes without pay. Main workroom, 3 flatbed knitting frames under canvas. Frame A, nearest south window, 120 needles present except 7 missing between positions 41 and 52. Carriage rusted but moving 1 inch with pressure. Frame B, central cover torn, needle bed dirty, tension mast intact. Frame C, rear, partial disassembly, tools absent, possible parts source, 2 circular sock machines, maker's plates obscured, cylinders present, ribber attachments missing, winding bench, 6 spindles, belt dry. Swift, 1 arm broken, repairable with dowel, workable, pine, split along west edge, crates of bobbins approximately 80 by quick count, many with remaining wool. Rear storage, broken chair, 2 broom handles, bundle of warped lath, crate of glass shards, 3 rusted hinges, empty oil cans, 1 sack of hardened plaster. Bobbin room, shelves full height on east wall, lower racks accessible, upper racks dust heavy, ladder on wall, cedar discs in several bobbins, possibly moth deterrent, strong smell of dry wool and wood, no active leak visible except ceiling stain near rear corner. She paused there, pencil lifted. Cedar discs. She returned to the bobbin room with the lamp. In daylight, the room had been merely crowded. In lamplight, it became deliberate. The shelves were hand-built, each support pegged rather than nailed, and the bobbins had not been thrown there carelessly. The lowest rows held the largest wooden cylinders, scarred at the rims. Higher up were smaller bobbins, then cones, then a long rack of shuttle-like carriers with thread still wound tight around their centres. At the very top, the board she had noticed before remained a little out of line. She was not ready for the height yet, so she began below. Ruthie had taught her that a room of tools should be read the way one reads weather. No single sign gave the whole truth. Weight, sound, dust. Where? The place where hands reached most often. The place they avoided. Della lifted the first bobbin from the second shelf. It was light, hollow, dry. She tapped the end with 1 knuckle. The sound was open. She lifted another. The same. A third, wrapped in blue wool, carried a cedar disc tucked into the centre hole. It gave off that dry, clean smell she had noticed. She worked along the shelves, not searching for treasure, but learning the room. Some bobbins were warped from damp. Some had splits. Some carried paper labels written in faded ink. Navy rib, child cuff, moss border, Pratt order, school grey. The labels were workaday things, the fossil marks of ordinary making. She set each bobbin back exactly where she found it. On the upper middle shelf, she discovered a row that did not sound like the others. The first bobbin in that row was heavier than its size allowed. She held it in both hands, then lifted another from the same rack. Different. The second was light. The first carried weight near one end. She tapped it. The sound came back dull, not hollow. She turned it toward the lamp and saw a cedar disc fitted inside the end, but too neatly. Most discs had been cut by hand, a little uneven, their grain visible. This one sat flush and smooth with a hairline seam around it. Della did not pry. She set it on the table, selected another from the row and tested it. Hollow. Another hollow. The fourth was heavy, dull. Cedar disc flush. She placed it beside the first. Her breath had become shallow, and she made herself slow down. A careless person ruins what a careful person hid. By the time she finished the row, she had found 6 weighted bobbins. She carried them to the main work table because the light was better there, and because the stove, though low, gave enough warmth to keep her fingers useful. With the putty knife, she examined the first seam. The cedar disc had not been glued. It had been pressed into place with a hidden notch, so fine that dust had made it invisible. She turned the bobbin, found the point where the grain shifted, and worked the knife in gently. The disc lifted a fraction. Inside was cotton. Not money, not jewelry. Cotton wrapped around a small steel tool blackened with oil. Della drew it out and laid it on the table. It was a transfer comb, narrower than Ruthie's, with fine teeth and a handle worn by use. Beside it was a packet of needles wrapped in waxed paper. The paper labelled 120 bed, fine latch, keep dry. The second heavy bobbin held 2 brass weights shaped for a tension mast and a small screwdriver with a rosewood handle. The third held hand-cut pattern cards, each punched carefully, each tied with thread. The fourth contained a bone-handled latch hook, smoother and finer than the bent brass one in Della's shoe. The fifth held a little vial of machine oil, sealed with wax and still half full. The sixth held raw wool, not much, a lock of clean fleece wrapped in blue paper and labelled Leicester, spring clip, 1958. These were not riches in the way newspapers meant the word. They were better than that. In the language of the room, hidden tools, kept tools, the sort of things a craftsperson might preserve if she feared careless hands would scatter them. Della sat on the bench and looked at the open bobbins until the lamplight trembled. Then she remembered the highest rack. The ladder in the bobbin room was heavier than it looked. Dust came down when she lifted it from its hooks, and one rung had softened along the left side, so she tested every step with her weight before climbing. She carried the lamp in one hand, climbed 3 rungs, came down, moved the ladder, climbed again. The top shelf was still beyond easy reach. She stood with one foot on the 4th rung, one hand gripping the side rail, and stretched upward. The crooked board did not sit loose because of rot. It had been cut shorter at one end. From below it looked like a mistake. From near the ceiling she saw the deliberate bevel, the small shadow line behind it, and the 2 peg heads darkened to match the wood. She touched the board, it moved inward a 1/4 inch, then stopped. She pushed upward, nothing. She pressed the left peg, nothing. The right peg shifted. The board tipped forward. Della caught it before it fell. Dust poured over her wrist and into her sleeve. Behind the board, set into the wall between 2 studs, was a narrow compartment lined with dark paper. It held a metal box painted green, though dust had muted the colour nearly to grey. The box was not large, about the size of a bread tin, and it had been wedged tightly in place with folded cloth on either side. Getting it down took 20 minutes. She moved slowly because the ladder complained and because fear had returned in a new form. The box was heavier than she expected. Twice it nearly slipped. She held it against her chest and descended 1 rung at a time, feeling the ladder flex beneath her. When her feet reached the floor, she stayed there, arms around the box, forehead against the cool painted metal. The lid had no lock, only 2 side clasps, stiff with age. She did not open it in the bobbin room. She carried it to the work table, set the lamp beside it, and washed her hands in the jar water, though they were already stained with soot, dust, and machine oil. Then she sat. The mill had gone very still around her. Even the mice seemed to have withdrawn into the walls. Rain had stopped outside. Creek water moved steadily in the dark. She opened the first clasp. The sound was small. The second clasp resisted, then released with a click so clean it seemed recent. She lifted the lid. On top lay a folded piece of linen, yellowed at the creases. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a notebook bound in brown board. Under the notebook were packets of paper tied with string. Under those, money. Della closed the lid again. Her hand remained on the box. She could feel her pulse against the metal for a while. She did nothing except sit with the fact of it near her. The stove made a low settling sound. One ember shifted behind the mica window. When she opened the box the second time, she removed each item as if the person who had placed it there might still care how it was handled. The linen cloth first. It was embroidered in one corner with the initials EW, the stitches exact and faded blue. The oilcloth bundle next. Inside was the notebook thick with pages, its spine softened but intact. She did not open it beyond the first page. There, in dark ink, written in a hand both firm and narrow, were the words Pattern Book, 400 Original Designs, Whitcomb Valley Knitting Works, 1922-1962. Della laid it down and covered it again with the cloth. The tied packets came next. Some held paper money sorted by denomination and wrapped in bank bands so old they had browned. Some held envelopes. One held silver coins in a cloth bag tied with black thread. At the bottom sat a smaller tin, unpainted, with tape across the lid. On the tape someone had written, "Do not spend first." She did not understand that, so she set it aside. The money required order. She cleared the work table, wiped dust from the surface, and divided the contents by type. Bills first. Ones, fives, tens, 20s, 50s, and a few $100 notes, older than any money she had held but still recognizable as currency. Some were silver certificates. Some carried seals she had only seen in library books. She counted twice, then a third time, because the number refused to belong to the room. $44,500. Then the coins. The cloth bag held Morgan silver dollars, worn smooth at the faces but heavy and cold, dated from the 1880s and 1890s. There were peace dollars from the 1920s, half dollars, Mercury dimes, Roosevelt dimes silver enough to sound bright against one another, buffalo nickels with dates nearly gone, wheat pennies dark as old blood, and 3 Indian head cents wrapped separately in tissue. At the bottom of the bag were 73 cents in ordinary change, newer than the rest, as if someone had emptied a pocket to finish the count. She wrote it down because writing made her breathe. Cash, $44,500. Coins, 73 cents loose, plus silver and old coinage not counted for spending. Other, 1 military medal, 1 notebook, letters unopened, tools recovered from bobbins. The medal lay inside the smaller tin. It was wrapped in cotton and pinned to a piece of dark blue ribbon. The bronze had dulled, but the shape remained clear, a worn cross with an eagle at its centre. Beside it was a folded card, no larger than a prayer card, bearing the name Thomas Edwin Whitcomb, 1918. Della did not know the medal's proper history. She only knew enough to stop touching it casually. She placed it on the linen cloth and bowed her head without planning to. There are objects that make silence around themselves. The envelopes remained. There were 3 tied together, one had no name, one was labelled for the one who understands the frames. The last, written in the same narrow hand as the notebook, read when the house is warm enough to keep you. The sentence entered Della carefully and stayed. She did not open any of them. It would have been easy to tear into the paper, to let hunger and fear call themselves need. But the room had been teaching her for 3 days that not all doors were opened because a hand had found them. Some waited for order, some waited for fire, clean water, daylight, and a person steady enough to receive what had been kept. She returned the money to the box, but not carelessly. Bills in their packets, coins in the cloth bag, medal in its tin, notebook wrapped again, envelopes on top. She closed the lid, fastened both clasps, and sat with the green box in her lap until her legs went numb. Then she stood, carried it into the front office, and placed it in the lowest desk drawer, after prying the swollen wood free with the putty knife. The drawer did not close fully, so she wedged it with the broken chair rung. It was not secure. Nothing in the mill was secure. Still, it was hidden from the door, hidden from a passing glance, and for that night, hidden enough. She did not sleep. Instead, she put on her shoes and went outside. The rain had washed the air clean. Clouds moved low over the valley, and the moon showed only as a pale place behind them. Behind the mill, the creek ran fuller than before, carrying leaves against stones and releasing them. Della walked to the bank and stood where the mud held her footprints from the day she had washed her hands. The water made its own speech, continuous and untroubled by human discovery. She looked back at the building. From outside, it was only the condemned annex again. Leaning brick, broken windows, a roof that would not keep winter out. No one passing on the road would see the green box in the desk drawer, or the notebook that held 400 designs, or the medal from a war whose grief had outlived the uniform. No one would know that a girl who had slept in stations and barns now possessed more money than she had ever imagined touching, and that she stood in the mud without deciding to spend it. A lesser story would have made her run to town at first light. Della did not run. She stayed by the creek until cold moved through her coat and into her bones. She watched the dark water fold around stones, separate, and come together again. She thought of Ruthie's instruction to lift a mistake back to the place where care had wandered. She thought of the tools hidden inside bobbins, not for display, but for the hand that might know why they mattered. She thought of Mrs. Haskell pressing the seal into paper, and Mr. Pritchard writing her debt into a ledger as if her name belonged there. Near dawn she returned inside. The stove had gone out, but the room still held a faint trace of heat. She washed her face with the last water in the jar, wiped the table clean, and opened the pattern book only far enough to see the second page. There was no decoration there, no sentimental note, only rows of careful marks, numbers, lines, repeats, and margin instructions written by someone who trusted the future to be literate in work. Della closed it again. The letter could wait until morning. The mill was patient, so was she. Morning came pale and exact, with frost along the inside of the broken panes, and a thin brightness lying over the machines. Della woke before the room warmed. She had slept only in pieces, if the night could be called sleep at all. The desk drawer remained wedged shut with the broken rung. The green box remained within it. Nothing in the mill had shifted except the light. She rose carefully, as if any sudden movement might scatter what the night had placed in order. First she carried kindling to the stove. Then she opened the draught, laid paper under dry splinters and struck one match. Smoke lifted obediently into the pipe. The flame took with a low sound, blue at the base, gold at the torn edges. She fed it no more than it could use. Only when the little circle of heat had begun to form did she pull the drawer open. The green box was cold in her hands. On the work table she laid out the linen cloth, the pattern book, the medal in its tin, and the 3 envelopes, the one marked "Read when the house is warm enough to keep you rested" on top. The handwriting was not Ruthie's. Ruthie's letters had leaned forward, quick and practical, with numbers written larger than words. This hand stood upright, narrow and deliberate, each line spaced as if the writer had measured both ink and breath. Still, there was something in it Della recognized. Not the shape of the letters, but the patience behind them. She sat on the bench with the stove at her back and opened the envelope by lifting the flap where the old glue had already given way. The paper inside had been folded twice, then once more lengthwise. Its creases were deep, brown at the edges, and soft from having waited in one position through decades of heat, cold summer damp and winter contraction. Della unfolded it with both hands. The first line waited at the top in the same careful ink. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then either my fear was foolish or my hope was not. I will accept either judgment from Providence, because by the time these words are read, I will have no further use for pride. My name is Eleanor Whitcomb Hale. I am writing this on the 8th day of October in the year 1962 at the long table in the bobbin room of the Whitcomb Valley Knitting Works Annex in Northampton, Massachusetts. Dr. Samuel Pierce of Springfield has told me plainly what my body has already been telling me in a less educated manner. The growth in my lungs is malignant. He used careful words and I thanked him for them, because a careful word is a kindness when the truth itself is severe. I have been given months, perhaps a little more if winter is merciful. I'm not writing because I'm afraid to die. I'm writing because I'm afraid of what dies when no one knows where to place their hands. The work in this house did not begin with me. My great-grandmother Abigail Whitcomb, born Abigail Sayer in 1819 in Belchertown, learned frame knitting from her uncle who had learned it from a man out of Nottinghamshire. She married Ezra Whitcomb in 1841 and brought two things into his family, a chest of linen and the habit of writing down what the hand discovered. Ezra's father, Nathaniel Whitcomb, had carded wool in Hadley before the canal changed the way goods moved through the valley. Their son, my grandfather Josiah, born 1845, built the first workroom behind the house in Florence with one frame, 3 lamps, and more courage than capital. My father, Thomas Josiah Whitcomb, born 1874, moved the shop closer to the rail spur and named it Whitcomb Valley Knitting Works in 1891. I was born into the sound of needles and carriage iron in 1898, and before I could read words, I could hear a dropped stitch. 4 generations are not a kingdom. They are only hands repeated. On March 16th, 1962, the order came from Boston that ended us. Not by malice, I suppose. The purchaser wanted quantities we could not produce at prices that would have made honest work dishonest. The mill in Worcester had new machinery. The southern factories had cheaper labour. Stores wanted uniform garments wrapped and labelled as if no person had touched them. Our final paid lot was 12 dozen children's ribbed stockings in school grey, packed on April 3rd. The last carriage crossed the bed at 4:17 in the afternoon. I know the hour because I stopped the clock myself. After that there was silence. 30 years of it had been gathering already, though we did not admit it. One woman retired. One man took work at the paper plant. 2 girls married and moved west. My brother Harold never came back from Belleau Wood, and my husband Peter, who served in France in 1918 and returned with lungs that never trusted the world again, died during the second winter after the armistice. My son Samuel enlisted in 1943 and was killed near Monte Cassino in Italy. The government sent a flag. They sent words printed well. They did not know how his hands held wool when he was 5. I do not accuse the world of changing. The world has never asked permission to do so. But I could not bear that everything made here would become only scrap, only weight, only an auctioneer's lot. I have hidden what I could. The money is not wealth, though it may appear so to someone who has known little of it. It is wages saved, orders paid in cash, war bonds redeemed when I had no heir willing to learn the frames, and the stubborn thrift of women who saved buttons, string, soap slivers and dignity. Spend it slowly. Better still, let it repair what will keep you dry. A roof is not vanity. A sound chimney is not extravagance. A locked door is not greed. Food bought without shame is not waste. The pattern book is the truer inheritance. There are 400 designs inside it, composed over 40 years. Some are mine, some began with Abigail's notes, some came from my father's corrections, some were taught to me by women whose names were never placed on ledgers though their eyes and fingers kept this house alive. Do not publish them quickly. Do not sell them cheaply. Learn 10 before you teach 1. Learn 1 before you change it. If a pattern resists you, ask whether your tension is wrong before you accuse the yarn. For the hand frame, set the fine latch needles with the beards clean and the hooks free on a 120 needle flat bed. Check the end needles twice because pride often hides at the edges. For worsted 2-ply, hold the room at no less than 60 degrees if the air is damp, and let the yarn rest overnight before working. If the wool has been stored cold, bring it near warmth, not onto heat. Sudden warmth makes it lie to you. For ribbing 2x2, transfer by hand until your fingers know the passage without looking. Do not force a tight loop. A forced loop becomes a weak place, and a weak place becomes a future repair. For cuffs, work 16 rows firm, then ease the gauge 1/4 turn for the body. For children's stockings, strengthen the heel with 1 strand silk to 3 strands wool if silk can be had, or linen if it cannot. Wash finished work in water no hotter than 102 degrees. Use 1 tablespoon grated Castile soap to a basin, no harsh soda. Rinse twice. Press between towels. Block while damp, never dripping. Dry flat, away from stove heat, with patience enough to let the shape become itself. There is lanolin in the lower tin if age has not ruined it. Warm it in a cup set inside hot water, never over flame. For moths, cedar helps, but cleanliness helps more. Turn stored work at the change of seasons. Sun is a tool if used gently, so is cold. You may wonder why I hid these things instead of giving them to a museum. I considered it. A museum might preserve the objects and forget the obedience they require. A locked case can keep dust away, but it cannot hear whether the carriage rides hard. I wanted these things to find a person before they found an institution, not because a person is safer. People are seldom safe, but a person may be changed by responsibility in a way a cabinet cannot. Inheritance is not ownership first, it is answerability. If you are young, forgive me for leaving you so much burden with so little explanation. If you're old, forgive me for making you begin again. If you are neither Whitcomb nor Hale by name, do not trouble yourself over blood. Blood is a door some enter by, but work is the room where kinship proves itself. If you found the box by greed, the patterns will punish you with confusion. If you found it by care, they will teach you slowly. Behind the house, beyond the well and toward the walnut line, there is an iron horseshoe grown into the second tree from the lane. My father set it there the summer the annex roof was finished. He said every working house needed a sign that luck had been asked in, not demanded. Beneath that tree we buried the first broken needle bed, because he would not throw away iron that had earned its rest. Stand there when you are uncertain. The tree has heard worse and remained. I have left 1 candle in the blue tin with the medal. It was poured the winter Samuel was born. I never burned it. I thought there would be a proper evening. Then years passed, and proper evenings became as rare as obedient grief. Light it when you know whether you will stay, not before. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Eleanor Whitcomb Hale, October 8, 1962. Della read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again, slower, though some lines had already entered her so deeply that reading them a second time felt less like learning and more like being found. The stove made a modest heat behind her. Dust shifted in the workroom light. Outside, a bird called once from the walnut line and then withheld itself. She laid the pages on the table in order. Her fingers had left faint grey marks along the edges where soot still lived in her skin. She almost brushed them away, then stopped. The paper had waited through worse than a girl's hands. On the 3rd reading, she did not finish. She stopped at the sentence about blood and work, and rested both palms flat on the table. There were no tears at first, only breath that would not settle. The building seemed to have moved closer around her, not pressing, not enclosing, but attending. It was one thing to own a condemned structure because a clerk had stamped a paper. It was another to be addressed from a morning 60 years gone by a woman who had no way to know whether the next pair of hands would be cruel, careless, hungry, or alone. Della folded the letter along its original creases. She did not improve them, she did not square the corners into new obedience. The old folds knew where they belonged. She slid the pages back into the envelope, then placed the envelope on top of the pattern book, not inside the green box, not yet. Some things needed to remain near light after being brought out of hiding. Then she took the blue tin. The medal lay inside with the small candle wrapped beside it in waxed cloth. The candle was shorter than she expected, thick around the middle, the colour of old cream, with a wick blackened at the tip though it had never been lit. It smelled faintly of beeswax and dust, and something floral that had nearly vanished. She did not light it yet. First, she went out the back door. The air had warmed just enough for frost to loosen from the weeds. Behind the mill, the ground sloped toward the creek, then rose again toward the walnut line. Della passed the well, its concrete cover damp and dark. She passed the sumac and the fallen branches she had not yet gathered. The second walnut from the lane was larger than the others, with a trunk split slightly on one side and bark ridged deep as folded cloth. She found the horseshoe at shoulder height, or rather, she found half of it. The tree had grown around the iron so slowly and so completely that the metal seemed less attached than remembered by the wood. One curved side remained visible, black with age, its nail holes filled with bark. The other side had disappeared under living growth. Della reached out and touched it with 2 fingers. Cold iron, living tree. Below, the ground rose in a shallow mound, barely noticeable under leaves. She knelt and brushed aside the wet litter with her hand. There was no marker, no name, no sign of the broken needle bed except the letter's testimony, and the slight unnatural levelness of soil where time had tried to smooth the fact away. She stayed there a long while. The walnut branches moved above her without leaves. Beyond them, the mill's brick wall showed through the trees, damaged and ordinary, smoke lifting faintly from its chimney because she had made a fire clean enough to draw. She looked at that smoke and understood why Eleanor had said the house was not empty. Emptiness did not keep instruction. Emptiness did not hide tools inside bobbins. Emptiness did not leave a candle for someone who had not yet decided whether she could stay. The tree had heard worse and remained. Della stood when her knees began to ache. She did not make a promise aloud. Promises made too early could become another form of vanity. She only touched the horseshoe once more, then walked back toward the rear door, taking care not to slip on the damp grass. Inside, she cleaned the top of the work table with a rag and placed the candle in the center. She found a saucer in the office desk, chipped along the rim, but whole enough to hold wax. She set the candle upright in a pool of melted wax from its own base, warming the bottom between her hands until it softened. Then she waited. The stove burned steadily. The room held the smell of wood heat, soot, wool, and old paper. The machines stood beneath their dust and covers, unchanged, yet nothing about them seemed abandoned now. She struck a match. For one breath. The flame leaned away from the wick, then it caught. The candle burned low and steady, not bright, not ceremonial in any public way. It gave a circle of honey-coloured light barely larger than a dinner plate. Della sat before it with the letter folded beside the pattern book and the medal tin closed near her elbow. She watched the flame until her eyes adjusted to its smallness. A proper evening, Eleanor had written. Della did not know whether this qualified. She only knew that no one in the world knew where she was, and yet she had never sat in a room more crowded with witness. She thought then of the chain that had brought her there. Not a grand chain, not one forged by powerful people, a little chain, almost invisible, the librarian in the oatmeal cardigan who had told her where the county office stood, the woman in Chicopee who had brought boiled eggs, a banana, and folded money without asking for confession, Mrs. Haskell, who had held back $1 under the courthouse paperweight for reasons too exact to explain, Mr. Pritchard, who had written her name into a ledger and handed over a manual because scared people who read instructions might live. There was the diner woman, too, the one who had given her the heel of bread without calling it mercy, and the gas station driver who had said the temperature allowed, letting Della understand the night before it arrived. None of them had saved her in the large way people like to praise. None had repaired the roof, signed the student forms, or opened a bedroom door. They had only given small things, and the small things had made a narrow bridge where no bridge had been promised. If you're watching this tonight and you remember such a kindness, one that looked small to the person who gave it but large to the life that received it, write it down where someone can see it. A ride offered in bad weather, a meal placed quietly in a bag, a teacher who noticed, a neighbour who fixed something and left before thanks became difficult. Some of us are still here because of gestures too modest to call themselves rescue. Tell us about one of them in the comments, if you can bear to. These stories travel farther when they carry real gratitude with them. Della let the candle burn for 1 hour. She measured the time by the office clock, which did not run, and by the lowering of the wax, which did. When the flame reached halfway down, she pinched it out with damp fingers the way Ruthie had done with prayer candles in church basements after funerals. Smoke rose in a thin blue line and disappeared into the dim rafters. She rapped the candle again, shorter now, changed but not spent. Then she began putting the heirlooms near her sleeping place. Not the money, The money returned to the green box, sealed and placed inside the desk drawer. It could wait under wood, but the pattern book she wrapped in the linen cloth and laid beside the sweater, the letter she placed on top of it, the medal tin she set close enough that her hand would touch it if she woke afraid, the recovered tools from the bobbins she lined up along the wall, transfer comb, latch hook, tension weights, fine needles, screwdriver, oil vial, pattern cards. They looked small there, almost poor. Yet together they seemed to have more authority than any furniture in the room. Night came gently for once. The fire had warmed the workroom enough that the office did not feel like a cellar. Outside, the creek ran over stones in the dark. Rainwater moved somewhere in the roof, but not heavily. The machines waited beneath their covers. The bobbin room held its emptied hiding place without apology. Della lay down on the floor with the sweater under her head and the heirlooms beside her. Before sleep came, she opened her eyes once more and looked through the cloudy glass partition toward the main room. The candle's scent still lingered in the air, faint beeswax over soot and wool. She could not see the highest rack from where she lay. She did not need to. The room had given what it was ready to give. She drew the coat closer around her shoulders and placed one hand on the folded letter. The house was not empty. The first snow came on December 3rd, beginning before daylight as a dry whisper against the boarded windows. By noon, 4 inches lay over Shuttle Road, over the walnut hulls, over the sagging loading platform, and along the edges of the slate roof where the broken places had been easiest for weather to find. The mill seemed to lower itself beneath the snow, not defeated, only made more visible by contrast. Every missing shingle, every uneven line, every place where water had entered and lingered, showed itself in white. Della stood outside with Mr. Pritchard's repair manual under her coat and looked up until her neck ached. She had read the roofing chapter 3 times. The first reading had given her fear, the second had given her words, the third had given her a sequence, and sequence was the beginning of any work that hoped to be honest. She copied the measurements into the back of an old payroll form. South slope 31 feet by 17 feet, north slope 31 by 16.5, loading platform overhang 8 by 4, chimney flashing compromised on east side, ridge cap missing 6 feet. The manual called for a roof square to mean 100 square feet. She did the arithmetic on the office desk with a pencil stub, crossing out twice when cold made her numbers lean. 6.5 squares if she counted waste. More if hidden rot waited under the patched metal. She would need asphalt shingles, not slate, because slate belonged to a wealthier repair than this winter allowed. She would need 15-pound felt, roofing nails, flashing tar paper, a chalk line, a pry bar, and more courage than she could write in any column. At Pritchard Hardware, Calvin did not praise the list. He corrected it. 7 squares, he said, drawing a firm line through her total. You will ruin some learning. Yes, sir. 30-pound felt near the chimney, 15 elsewhere if you must. Yes, sir. Roofing nails, 1.25 inch, galvanized, not common nails. Common nails will shame you. Yes, sir. He went into the back and returned carrying a roofing hatchet with a square pole, a gauge notch near the blade, and a handle darkened almost black. My Uncle Leland's, he said. He roofed barns from here to Hatfield until his knees gave out. I cannot buy that. I did not ask you to. Della touched the handle, then drew her hand back. I will return it. You had better. The old roofer arrived the next morning with Calvin in a pickup truck that coughed twice after the engine shut off. His name was Amos Tully. He wore a canvas coat, rubber overshoes, and a wool cap pulled low over ears that had been bitten red by years of weather. His face was narrow and brown spotted, his mouth nearly hidden by a grey moustache, and his hands had the flattened look of hands that had struck nails through too many winters to count. I do not take pay, he said, before Della could offer any. I have very little to offer. That makes it easy. Calvin unloaded bundles of shingles, rolls of felt, a coffee can of nails, flashing scraps, and a coil of rope. All of it went onto the ledger. Della watched each item enter debt, but Amos was already walking the perimeter, looking not at the bill but at the building. He leaned back, studied the roof line, spat once into the snow, and pointed with his chin. That raft is tired. The tired rafter was beneath the south slope, near the chimney where water had travelled for years. Inside they found the damage by climbing onto the loft boards above the workroom. The old rafter had not broken fully. It had softened along one side and bowed under load. Amos tapped it with the roofing hatchet. The sound was wrong. "Sister it," he said. He showed her how to cut a new length of 2x6. Not new in the store sense, but sound lumber from a pile Calvin had salvaged from a demolished carriage house. They laid the new piece against the old rafter, matching the bearing points, and fastened it with staggered carriage bolts and washers, not nails alone. Amos made her drill pilot holes by hand because the bit brace gave more control than a borrowed electric tool would have given. Her arms ached before the first bolt tightened. "Wood splits when hurried," Amos said. On the roof. He did not soften his teaching. The first day was only stripping. They worked from the loading platform side where the pitch could be approached from a ladder tied through a window opening. Della learned to set the ladder feet into scraped earth, not snow. She learned to keep 3 points of contact, to pass tools by rope rather than by reaching, to lay removed shingles in controlled piles instead of letting them slide. Beneath the old tar patch, the roof boards were blackened but mostly firm. 2 had to be replaced. One crumbled in a corner when Amos pressed it with the hatchet. "That board lies," he said. They pulled it. For 11 days, weather allowed just enough work to continue. Some mornings began with frost on the nail heads and breath hanging thick under the eaves. Some afternoons warmed into mud. Amos spoke in sentences so short they became part of the hammering. "Chalk line," Della snapped it. "Too loose," she rewound. "That nail's proud." She looked. "Pull it." She pulled. 3 strokes. She tried. No, 3. He meant the rhythm, set, drive, seat, not 6 nervous taps, not 1 violent blow, 3 deliberate strikes that placed the nail flush without cutting the shingle. By the 4th day, her wrist began to understand. By the 7th, she could feel through the hammer when a nail had gone into sound wood and when it had found an old hole beneath. They worked the felt from bottom to top, overlapping each course, never trusting a seam to memory. Flashing around the chimney took nearly a full day. Amos bent the metal over the edge of the work table with a block and mallet, forming step flashing piece by piece. He made her fit each section into the mortar joint, then remove it, then fit it again, until the line lay close without force. "Water remembers insult," he said. She did not ask what that meant by then. She knew. The final ridge cap went on December 14th under a sky the colour of pewter. Della held the last shingle while Amos drove the nails. The new roof was not beautiful in a polished way. Its asphalt surface looked plain beside the few old slates saved near the front edge, but the south slope lay straight. The chimney stood properly flashed. The loading platform overhang no longer dripped into the wall. When they climbed down, Amos stood with one hand pressed against his lower back and looked up for a full minute. "It will shed," he said. That was his praise. That night, when the next snow came, Della stood in the workroom and listened. The old 3-patient leaks did not begin. The pans she had placed out of habit remained empty. Snow tapped the roof, slid, gathered, and stayed outside. She slept without moving the desk drawer away from the damp. By January, the roof had stopped the worst of the water, and the chimney began telling the truth about itself. The bricks above the stove thimble were spalling, their faces flaking off in thin red scales that gathered on the floor each morning. Mortar between them had powdered to the colour of old bone, where Della pressed with the screwdriver, entire joints side open. The chimney drew, but drawing was not the same as being sound. A fire that warmed a room could still be plotting harm behind brick. She took a chipped piece to Calvin Pritchard. He held it under the counter lamp and rubbed the mortar between finger and thumb. "Portland patch over lime," he said. "Someone got impatient 40 years ago. Can it be repaired?" "Most things can, not all things cheaply." He gave her no cement mix from the bright bags stacked near the door. Instead, he led her to a lower shelf where older materials sat in plainer sacks. Hydraulic lime, fire clay, washed sand. He explained that hard cement against soft historic brick could trap moisture and break the face from within. The chimney needed a kinder mortar, one that could breathe and move a little with the old masonry. 1 part hydraulic lime, he said, writing on brown paper. 1 part fire clay for heat where you need it. 3 parts sharp sand, small batches, peanut butter, not soup. Della repeated the ratio. He nodded. Dampen joints first. Mortar will not bond to dust and pride. The work took 3 weeks in temperatures that held mostly in the 20s. She set up a small scaffold from planks across 2 crates, never high enough to feel safe, only high enough to reach. Each morning she warmed her hands by the stove, then let the fire die low before working near the brick. She raked out loose joints with the bent screwdriver and a nail filed into a narrow pick. Dust fell into her hair, along her collar, into the cuffs of her sleeves. She brushed each joint clean with the wire brush. Then with a smaller brush, Calvin had lent her, then misted the brick with creek water from a jar. Her hands went numb every 15 minutes. At first she tried to continue through it, but numb fingers made foolish work. She learned to stop, tuck her hands under her arms, breathe until pain returned, then begin again. Pain meant she could feel the trowel. Pain meant she could judge pressure. Pain meant she had not become careless. The mortar was mixed in a dented pan on the work table, 1 scoop lime, 1 scoop fire clay, 3 scoops sand. She turned the dry materials together until the colour evened, then added water a little at a time. Too wet, and it smeared, too dry, and it fell from the joint like breadcrumbs. When the consistency held ridges from the trowel without slumping, she carried it to the chimney and packed it in with the patience of a person filling a wound. The first week was ugly. Her lines bulged, her joints varied. She dropped mortar down the clean-out and had to scoop it free before it hardened. Calvin came by on the 2nd Saturday, looked at the work, and did not flatter her. Cut back the proud joints before they set. She cut them. Brush diagonal, not straight. She brushed. Leave the face clean. You are not frosting a cake. She cleaned. On the 10th day, her hand improved. She learned the tuck-pointing motion, the slight press and draw, the way a narrow tool could compress mortar into a joint and leave a line that belonged to the brick rather than to her effort. She replaced 2 broken bricks near the thimble with salvaged ones from a collapsed garden wall behind the mill. Their colour did not match perfectly, but their softness did. That mattered more. The upper chimney, where it passed into the cold roof space, required Amos's help again. He came for one afternoon climbing with no ceremony, and showed her how to set a board across the joists so her weight would not find the ceiling below. Together they repaired the worst joint beneath the roofline. He said almost nothing until they were finished. "Smoke likes cracks," he told her. Then he left before she could offer coffee. Late in January, after the mortar had cured as well as winter allowed, Della made the test fire. She used only split kindling at first, then 1 small piece of dry hardwood from a fallen branch. The stove warmed slowly, the pipe drew clean. She went outside and watched the chimney top. Smoke rose pale and straight, no dark roll, no sideways leak through brick, no bitter smell escaping into the workroom wall. She came back inside, opened the clean-out, and found no falling mortar. The stove did not become a luxury. It became trust. That night the room held heat past midnight. Not much, not enough to make the office soft, but enough that water in the jar did not freeze, enough that her fingers could bend when she woke, enough that the pattern book could be opened without the paper feeling brittle under her hands. Della sat near the stove with Eleanor's letter beside her and copied the mortar ratio into a notebook of her own. She wrote slowly. A house, she was learning, did not forgive ignorance simply because a person meant well. It accepted care where care became exact. The floors had been waiting under dust, soot, oil, mouse leavings, dropped plaster, and 60 years of weather entering where weather had no right to enter. They were white pine in the front office and maple in the main workroom, though at first both had looked the same dark grey-brown. In the office, the boards were wide and soft enough to hold every chair scrape, every boot heel, every dragged desk, every winter grit carried in by workers who once came before sunrise. In the workroom, the maple planks were narrower and harder, laid with hand-cut rose head nails whose irregular heads caught the light when Della knelt close. She did not begin with sanding. She began with repair. Raised nails had to be set with a nail punch borrowed from Calvin. Splintered edges had to be pared clean with a sharp knife. 2 soft planks near the rear wall had to be lifted, dried by the stove, judged, and finally replaced with boards from a storage loft, where someone had kept offcuts under a tarp. The new boards were not new to the world, only new to that place. Their grain spoke closely enough to the others. Calvin rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day, a sum that made her stand silent at the counter. "Return it clean," he said. "I will, and do not stay in one place." "No, sir. Floor will remember if you panic." She carried the machine back like a sleeping animal, heavy and awkward against her hip. The first pass was 80 grit. The sander roared in the mill louder than any sound she had yet made there, filling the room with vibration until her teeth felt it. Dust rose despite the little cloth bag attached to the machine. She tied a handkerchief over her nose and worked with the grain, never across, moving slowly enough to cut, but not so slowly that she hollowed the boards. Under the first pass, the floor changed from grey to wounded gold. Not clean yet, not finished, but alive. The maple showed dark honey near the machines where oil had protected it, pale amber near the boarded windows, and almost black stains where water had stood too long. The office pine emerged softer, with knots like closed eyes and old nail shadows feathering outward. Della stopped often to empty the dust bag into a metal pail. She swept between passes, then wiped with a damp rag, because grit left behind would become scratches in the next cut. The second pass was 120 grit. That day her shoulders burned from the roof work returning through memory. The sander pulled against her arms, her knees ached from crouching near corners with folded sandpaper where the machine could not reach. She learnt the floor's unevenness through her body, the slight dip by the office threshold, the ridge near the central frame, the cupping along the rear wall. A level floor would have belonged to another building. This one only needed to be sound and clean enough to serve. The third pass was 220 grit. By then the room no longer looked abandoned, it looked unfinished, which was a different and more merciful condition. The rosehead nails in the maple lay like dark seeds in the boards. The pine in the office had warmed under the grain. When evening light entered through the cracks around the boards, it touched the floor and remained there, as if the wood had learned again how to receive. Della chose oil, not varnish. Calvin gave her tung oil and linseed oil, explaining the difference while measuring each into separate tins. Tung would resist water better, linseed would warm the colour. She mixed them carefully in a glass jar, 2 parts tung to 1 part boiled linseed, and tested the blend under the desk where no one would see. The wood darkened, then deepened, dark honey in the pine, something close to mahogany in the maple where age and oil met. The first coat took all day. She applied it with lint-free rags, working it into the grain, wiping away every excess shine after 20 minutes. Ruthie's instruction returned in another form. Too much care applied wrongly could become damage. Oil left standing would wrinkle and gather dust. The floor needed feeding, not drowning. 48 hours to cure. She waited. The second coat went on thinner, the third thinner still. Between coats she walked only in clean socks, stepping along edges, keeping ash and grit outside. The mill began to smell of oil, wood, faint smoke and drying winter air. It was not the smell of comfort yet, but it had moved beyond decay. Then came the bad morning. It was late January, a Tuesday though. Dates had begun to matter less than tasks. Della woke before dawn with her hands swollen, her back stiff, and a weariness so complete that even lifting water to the stove seemed like work beyond reason. The floor needed buffing. The office window needed a temporary patch. The well cover needed clearing again after a hard freeze. The ledger at Pritchard's had grown longer. The green box remained mostly untouched except for necessary purchases and the careful recording of every coin converted into repair. She sat on the office floor with one boot in her hand and could not put it on. No speech came, no lesson arranged itself. The body, having been asked for too much silence, gave its refusal in silence. After a while she stood, not to work but to leave the building. She walked past the walnuts and down toward a marshy stretch beyond the creek where cattails stood broken and brown above the ice. There she sat on a flat stone with her coat around her knees. The sky was low. The air smelled of frozen mud and distant wood smoke. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then, a great blue heron lifted from the far edge of the marsh. Its wings opened slowly, wider than seemed possible from such a narrow body. It rose without haste, legs trailing, neck folded, the grey of it nearly the same as the morning. Della watched it cross over the cattails and settle farther downstream, where the water remained open under a fringe of ice. She did not work that day. She returned at dusk, ate oats near the stove, and slept 10 hours without apology. The next morning, she buffed the floor. By February, light had become the next repair. There were 8 windows in the annex, 3 had no glass at all, only boards nailed across the frames from the inside. 4 were cracked, their panes held together by old putty, dirt and habit. 1 remained original according to a date scratched into the lower sash rail, 1788. That window did not belong to the annex's later construction, and Della puzzled over it until Calvin explained that old builders reused what they had, a sash from an earlier house, perhaps saved and set into a workroom wall because light was light and waste was foolish. "Do not replace that one," he said. "I was not going to." "Good." He lent her glazing points, a small diamond glass cutter, and a putty knife better than the cracked one she owned. She bought DAP 33 glazing putty on account, a quart can with a skin formed under the lid that Calvin told her to peel away, not mix in. He showed her how to roll putty between her palms until it warmed, press it into the rabbet, set the glass gently, secure it with points, then lay the outer bevel smooth in one continuous pull if the hand could manage it. The putty should shed water, he said, not decorate the sash. The first window took most of a day. She removed the boards and found the frame packed with dead flies, walnut leaves, and a mouse nest made partly from old payroll paper. The sash cords had rotted through, the counterweights lay hidden in their pockets, iron cylinders suspended by nothing waiting in the dark. She opened the side access panel with a narrow pry bar and found the weight by touch. Cold iron. Dust. A length of cord still tied around the eye, crumbling when she pulled. The replacement cord was 1/4-inch cotton sash cord. Calvin had made her practice the knot at his counter before letting her leave, around the counterweight eye, a figure-8 knot, dressed tight tail, long enough not to slip. Over the pulley, down the channel, through the sash, no nylon. Cotton would belong to the age of the thing and move properly over old brass pulleys once cleaned. She cleaned the pulleys with kerosene and a rag until they turned. Then she tied the first weight, fed the cord over, set the sash back into place and lifted. It rose 6 inches and stopped crooked. She lowered it, found the twist, untied, retied and tried again. The second lift was true. The sound of the weight moving inside the wall was small and satisfying, a hidden answer from the building. The missing panes were cut from salvaged glass Calvin found in his storage shed. It was not perfect. Some pieces waved when light passed through them. One held a seed bubble near the corner. Della liked that. Perfect glass would have looked dishonest in a room where every board had earned its scars. She bedded the glass in putty, pressed points into the sash with the edge of the putty knife, and worked the bevel slowly. Too much pressure smeared it, too little left gaps where water could sit. Her first line wobbled, she scraped it out and began again. The second was better. By the third window, her wrist learned the angle. The cracked panes required judgment. One crack in the north window ran only from corner to corner and did not admit water. She left it, sealing the edge lightly. Another crack had widened enough to move under her finger. That pane came out in 2 pieces, each carried to the trash crate wrapped in paper. She swept the sill, primed bare wood with the little oil Calvin had recommended, and waited until it tacked before setting new glass. The 1788 sash she treated like an elder. Its glass was wavy, faintly green at the edge, and its muntins were thin as a careful promise. The putty had failed along the bottom rail, but the pane still held. Della did not remove it. She warmed a small amount of putty in her hand and tucked it where the weather had opened a seam. No forcing, no improvement beyond need. She cleaned the glass with vinegar and newspaper, and when the grime lifted, light entered the room unevenly, bending through old glass the way memory bends through time. Each repaired window changed the mill more than she expected. The workroom did not become bright all at once. It gathered light in sections, first the south wall, then the front office, then the narrow rear window near the stove. Sun reached the floorboards she had oiled, and the maple answered with a low glow. Dust still existed. Broken plaster still waited. The machines still wore their covers, but the room no longer seemed to be holding its breath. On the last window she worked in the late afternoon while a chickadee sat on a walnut branch outside. It was a round little bird, grey and black capped, light enough that the branch barely lowered under it. It turned its head toward the glass as Della pressed the final glazing point into place. For several minutes the bird watched her, or seemed to. She rolled the last rope of putty between her palms, laid it along the lower edge, and drew the knife in one careful line. The bevel held. The chickadee flicked its wings, hopped once along the branch, and remained. Della cleaned the knife on a rag and looked through the newly set pane. The world outside was still February, snow crusted under the walnuts, creek water dark between ice, shuttle road soft with thaw and freeze. Nothing had become easy. The ledger still waited. The chimney still needed watching. The roof would need spring inspection. There were walls to mend, shelves to clean, machines to understand, and a trade sleeping under covers and paper. But wind no longer crossed the room at will. That evening she closed all 8 windows as well as they could close. The sash weights settled inside the walls with a low wooden hush. The stove burned small and steady. The oiled floor held the firelight. On the work table beside Eleanor's letter, the pattern book waited under linen. Della sat with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot water and listened to the mill keep its heat. 2 winters later, in December of 2024, the first finished pair of stockings came off the frame just after dark. Snow had been falling since afternoon, not heavily, only enough to soften the lane and gather along the lower branches of the walnuts. The mill no longer shivered when wind crossed the valley. Its roof held, its windows held. The stove drew cleanly through the repaired chimney, and the front room carried the amber smell of warmed pine, wool, beeswax, and lamp oil. Della sat at the restored flat bed frame with a lamp at her left hand and Eleanor's pattern book open beneath a linen weight. She had not chosen the simplest pattern. That would have been sensible, perhaps, but not true. She chose a narrow-ribbed stocking with a riverstone border, one of the older designs, written first in Abigail's notation and corrected twice in Eleanor's sharper hand. The instructions had taken 3 weeks to understand and 2 months to trust. The tension had been wrong at first, then the heel had puckered, then one cuff had drawn too tight because she had worked tired and tried to pretend she was not. Now the wool moved cleanly. The frame gave its dry, exact sound. Needles lifted and received. The carriage passed. Her hands transferred stitches where the ribbing required it, not quickly, not proudly, but with a steadiness that had taken 2 winters to earn. When she lifted the finished stocking from the bed, it did not look like a miracle. It looked like work completed properly. That was better. She laid it beside its mate on the table. The pair was soft grey, with a quiet border that only showed itself fully when light touched the raised pattern. It was the kind of garment a person might wear for years without knowing how many decisions had entered it. Gauge, twist, warmth, rest, the amount of soap in the washwater, the pressure of blocking pins, the discipline not to hurry drying near the stove. Della pressed the stockings between towels, shaped them damp, and left them flat on the old work table. For a while she only stood there. The room around her had changed without becoming new. The front office still held the old oak desk, repaired but not polished into forgetting. The calendar from 1962 remained on the wall, turned forever to November, its circled date preserved under glass. The metal lockers had been cleaned and oiled. One held lamp wicks and spare cord, one held folded cloths, and one held Ruthie's bent brass hook wrapped in wool. The workroom floor had darkened to deep honey and mahogany where years of oil and labour had returned through the grain. The machines no longer wore their dust-heavy covers. Frame A worked again. Frame B waited under a clean cloth, half restored. The circular sock machine stood along the north wall, not ready, but no longer abandoned. The bobbin shelves had been cleaned from bottom to top, and every empty cylinder had been rubbed with cedar oil and placed in order. The bobbin room was no longer a hiding place. It had become a memory room, though Della never called it that aloud. Eleanor's green box rested in a locked cabinet, now not because Della distrusted the walls, but because order had asked for it. The pattern book lived on the high shelf only when not in use. The recovered tools lay in a shallow drawer lined with linen. The military medal rested in its blue tin beside the shortened candle, which had been lit only 4 times. On the mantel above the stove lay the brass key. She had found it the previous winter, wedged inside a small oak box under the 3rd cellar step, along with a tin-type photograph from 1903. The woman in the photograph had stood outside this very building before the vines took hold of the rear wall, wearing a work apron and holding a latch hook in one hand. Her face had unsettled Della so deeply that she did not look at it again for 2 full days. Not because it was identical, it was not, but the set of the mouth, the brow, the watchfulness around the eyes carried forward like a stitch held through generations. On the back, in brown ink, someone had written, "Clara Whitcomb, daughter of Josiah, age 25, summer of 1903. The key had a bow shaped like a little knitted loop, elegant in a plain way, with a stem darkened by use. For months Della did not know what it opened. She tried no locks in town. She did not take it to Calvin. Some questions needed to remain inside the property until the property answered them. The answer came on December 12th, beneath the 2nd walnut tree. She had gone there to clear snow from the horseshoe, as she did before every deep freeze, touching the iron once with her gloved hand. While brushing bark with the back of her fingers, she noticed a brass plate nearly swallowed by the trunk on the far side, hidden where the tree had rolled its living wood around old metal. The plate was small, greened at the edges, and set with a keyhole no wider than a thumbnail. Della stood very still. Then she went back inside, took the brass key from the mantel and returned through the snow. The key entered with resistance at first, then turned. A narrow compartment opened in the tree. Not large, not deep, a hollow lined with old tin and sealed by the brass plate, protected from weather by the slow growth of the walnut around it. Inside lay a folded 48-star flag wrapped in oilcloth, its fabric thin but whole, and a note written on paper browned at the edges. She carried both inside before opening them. The note was from Clara Whitcomb, dated November 11th, 1918. It was not long. She wrote that the flag had covered no coffin and belonged to no ceremony. It had been hung in the workroom window the day the armistice was announced, while women stood among silent frames and wept for men living and dead with the same exhausted gratitude. Clara wrote that her brother Harold was still in France and that no letter had come for 6 weeks. She wrote that if he returned, the flag should be given to him. If he did not, it should remain with the house until someone could bear to fold it without bitterness. Della read the note twice, then placed the flag on the work table. She had learned by then how to touch inherited sorrow without claiming it too quickly. The next day, she took the blue tin, the card bearing Thomas Edwin Whitcomb's name, and the small military medal to Bridge Street Cemetery in Northampton. She had found the family plot after weeks of reading old records and walking rows of stones until names surfaced from lichen and time. It was Veterans' Day when she first brought the medal there, but the year of honouring that mattered most came later, on November 11th, 2024. She stood beside the stone of Peter Hale, who had returned from France and never fully come home, and near the marker for Samuel Hale, whose body rested in Italy though his name had been cut into Massachusetts granite. She did not leave the medal in the grass. Weather would have taken it, and theft might have mistaken it for metal. Instead, she held it in her palm while the church bell rang 11 times downtown, then wrapped it again and returned it to the tin. Honouring did not always mean surrendering an object. Sometimes it meant learning where it belonged before carrying it back. The money in the green box had changed less than anyone might expect. Della had spent only what the building required and recorded every dollar in a ledger Calvin had given her after the first winter. Roofing materials, chimney mortar, glass, oil, needles, a modest used cot, a second-hand coat after the first one gave way at both elbows, flour, oats, beans, soap, lamp oil, postage and taxes. When rare coins had to be evaluated, she brought 3 to an appraiser in Springfield and sold only one worn silver dollar whose value could repair the pump. The rest remained sealed, not untouched, not worshipped, simply kept. The old bills, the silver, the coins wrapped in tissue, and the amount Eleanor had hidden lay inside the green box with a new note in Della's hand. For the next one, if repair is needed more than memory, she did not know who that person would be. She no longer believed she had to know. Houses outlived certainty. Craft outlived intention when someone treated it carefully enough. The public reopening of the mill was almost invisible. There was no banner, no article, no speeches. Della did not want strangers coming to look at poverty transformed into spectacle, and she did not want anyone making the place smaller by calling it inspiring too quickly. Instead, she walked to Doris's cafe one cold morning with an index card and a tack. On the card, written in blue ink, were the words, Whitcomb Valley Hand Frames. Repair, stockings, cuffs, small commissions, by letter or Saturday inquiry. No rush orders. Doris pinned it to the corkboard between a church supper notice and a request for firewood. By spring, the mailing list had 43 names. Most were local, some had known Ruthie, some had known Calvin's sister. Some were younger women who had bought old sweaters at estate sales and wanted cuffs mended rather than thrown away. One letter came from Vermont, written by a woman whose mother had worn Whitcomb stockings as a girl and still remembered the way the heels outlasted the rest of the garment. Della answered every letter by hand. She refused half the work at first because she was not ready. Readiness, she had learned, was not the same as fear leaving. It was the point at which fear stopped making the decisions. Caleb came back in June with a sign. He was taller than he had been when he first appeared on his Schwinn bicycle offering to split wood, because his mother had told him about Della's grandfather, though the family connection had turned out more complicated than either of them understood. Now he arrived with the sign wrapped in an old quilt and tied to the back of his truck. He had carved it himself from walnut that had fallen beyond the creek after a storm. Della met him at the loading platform. "Need help hanging it?" he asked. She looked at the quilt. "I need to see it first." He grinned in the shy, contained way of a person trying not to show how much the answer mattered. Together they unwrapped the board. Whitcomb Valley, Knitting Works and Daughters. The letters were hand-cut, deep and clean, darkened with oil, the ampersand curled like a loop of yarn turning back through itself. At the end, the word daughters stood plural, not because Caleb knew all the history, but because he had listened to enough of it. Abigail, Clara, Eleanor, Ruthie, Della. Women whose names had not always been on bills of sale or property records, but whose hands had carried the trade when records had failed to be honest. Della ran her fingers along the carved letters. "You added something," she said. "Seemed missing." It was... They hung it below the original sign, not replacing the old name but answering it. Caleb held the ladder while Della drove the screws, 3 strokes for each because Amos Tully's teaching had outlived the roof. When the sign settled into place, the building looked altered in the smallest possible way, and therefore truly. That evening, Della began her own letter. She sat at the oak desk in the front office, the same desk whose lower drawer had once held the green box behind a broken chair rung. The windows were open. Summer air moved through the workroom, carrying the smell of walnut leaves, creek water, oiled wood, and washed wool drying flat on linen racks. The first pair of stockings lay wrapped in brown paper for a woman in Florence who had waited 3 months without complaint. Della took a sheet of good paper from the drawer. She dipped the pen, then stopped. It was not that she had nothing to say, it was that the right words had to leave room for a reader she could not imagine. A girl, perhaps, an old woman, a stranger, someone with the name, someone without it, someone careful, someone desperate, Someone who might arrive cold and hungry, carrying one object from a life that had closed behind her. At last, Della wrote the first line. "My dear one, whoever you are." She sat back and let the ink dry. There would be time to explain the roof, the chimney, the floorboards, the pump, the cellar, the walnut key, the flag, and the way old wool behaves when brought too close to stove heat. There would be time to tell where the money had gone and where it had not. There would be time to warn against pride at the edges, against hurried knots, against selling what had not yet been understood. For now, the opening was enough. Outside, evening lowered itself over Shuttle Road. The new sign moved slightly in the warm air. The horseshoe rested in the walnut, half iron and half tree. In the workroom, the frame waited with needles set clean and true. On the corkboard at Doris's cafe, the index card had already begun to curl at one corner, from steam and weather carried in on coats. The knitting mill waits. It has always waited. And in the county clerk's office, inside a drawer beneath Mrs. Haskell's old courthouse paperweight, one folded dollar bill still remained, kept out of the sale, not as evidence and not as error, but as a quiet witness to the morning a homeless girl placed $7 on a counter, and bought back a house that had never truly stopped belonging to careful hands.